Mackie's error theory argues that everything ever believed about morality is fundamentally wrong, not just a little off, entirely mistaken, down to its very foundation. According to J.L. Mackie, when people say things like murder is wrong or you should help the poor, they think they're stating objective facts. But Mackie says they're not. There are no objective moral values, none. Every moral claim, no matter how deeply felt, no matter how widely agreed upon, is based on a false assumption that right and wrong exist independently, like mountains or planets. They don't. We just made them up. Mackie's error, theory of morality. This is where it starts to feel like a trap, because if Mackie is right, then every moral judgment becomes a kind of illusion, a collective hallucination that we all agreed to see just to keep society from tearing itself apart. The idea that murder is wrong, that kindness is good, that justice matters, all of it might be built on nothing more than emotion, habit, or cultural conditioning. And if that's true, what's left? How do we live or choose or condemn anything without the anchor of right and wrong? He wasn't saying we should become monsters. He was saying we already believe in monsters and heroes for reasons that aren't logically grounded. When someone calls something evil, they're not describing an actual quality in the world. They're projecting a feeling, like saying boo or ugh. That's the disturbing part. We don't see moral claims as expressions of personal taste, but that's what they might be. A person might say slavery is wrong with moral certainty, but according to Mackie, they're speaking as if a kind of moral gravity exists when it doesn't. It's not that people don't care about right and wrong, it's that the thing they care about might be fictional. We may be building legal systems, religions, and wars on something that doesn't actually exist. People live and die for these illusions, and if you dare to pull the curtain back, what stares back is emptiness, a world with no intrinsic meaning, only human projections trying to pretend they found truth. Mackie's theory doesn't just question morality, it burns it down and leaves you staring into the ashes, wondering what rules, if any, were ever truly real. Benatar's Anti-Natalism. Benatar's Anti-Natalism is a philosophy that cuts against one of the deepest instincts in human nature, the drive to create life. At its core, it claims that bringing someone into existence is always a harm, no matter how good their life may seem. Not sometimes, not in bad circumstances, always. According to philosopher David Benatar, to be born is to be harmed, and the most ethical thing anyone could do is to stop having children. This isn't just pessimism. It's a cold, surgical argument built on a comparison most people never make. Benatar lays it out like this: the absence of pain is good, even if there's no one there to enjoy it. But the absence of pleasure isn't bad unless someone already exists to miss it. So, if a person is never born, they miss out on pleasure, but they also avoid pain. And crucially, they don't suffer from that absence. But if they are born, they are guaranteed to experience suffering, physical pain, emotional trauma, loss, anxiety, death. The risk is built in, and consent is impossible. Nobody asks to be born. What makes this philosophy disturbing isn't just the logic, it's the way it weaponizes compassion. People usually have children out of love, hope, or joy, but Benatar says these emotions are traps, masking the truth, that creating life also creates the conditions for suffering. Even the happiest life includes illness, grief, aging, and death. And those aren't bugs, they're features, they're guaranteed. By choosing to reproduce, people create another being who must one day suffer, maybe a little, maybe unimaginably. This idea doesn't stop at the individual. If taken seriously, it suggests an end to the human story, a quiet extinction chosen not from hatred, but from mercy. Not because people don't matter, but because they matter so much, their suffering must be avoided at all costs. Imagine a world where no one is born again, not from destruction, but from love, from refusing to inflict pain, even unintentionally. And yet, this compassion turns terrifying, because it leads to the conclusion that the best world is an empty one. No laughter, no art, no beauty, but also no despair, no war, no abuse, just silence, a peaceful nothingness where no one ever hurts again. Parfit's psychological continuity problem. Parfit's psychological continuity problem asks a question that feels like it should have an answer, but doesn't. What makes a person the same person over time? Not their body, not their name, not even their memories in any neat, reliable way. According to philosopher Derek Parfit, the thing most people believe to be solid, the self, isn't real. It's just a bundle of experiences and connections loosely stitched together across time, like a fading echo trying to call itself me. Parfit challenged the old idea that identity is something fixed. He argued that what truly matters isn't whether someone is the same person as they were yesterday, but whether there's enough psychological continuity, memories, intentions, beliefs to keep the narrative thread going. But here's the twist. Continuity can survive even if identity doesn't. In other words, a future version of you might still think your thoughts, hold your values, remember your childhood, and yet not be you in any meaningful way. This becomes deeply unsettling when pushed to extremes. Suppose your brain was split in half, and each hemisphere was placed into a different body. Both new people wake up believing they are you. Who gets to be you? Both? Neither? Parfit said that in such cases, identity simply doesn't matter, but emotionally, that answer doesn't sit still. It shatters the very idea of a soul or a single unbroken thread of consciousness. It says the self is not an indivisible thing. It's a pattern, a process, a fragile continuity that can flicker, duplicate, or dissolve. The fear that follows is sharp. If there's no fixed self, then who exactly is afraid? Who suffers? Who dies? If you are nothing more than a collection of connected thoughts and sensations, then losing memory or changing values might mean losing parts of yourself permanently. And yet the body continues, the voice continues, pretending the person is still intact. This realization fractures identity. It means that clinging to a singular self might be like holding water in your hands. Parfit's idea leaves behind a terrifying freedom. If the self isn't real in the way we think, then maybe death isn't what we think either, but neither is survival. The one thing that feels most intimate, your sense of being you, might be just a temporary arrangement of mental dust, pretending to be whole. Mereological Nihilism. Mereological nihilism takes a sledgehammer to the ordinary world. It says that objects, the things surrounding everyone right now, don't actually exist, not in the way they're believed to. Tables, chairs, houses, trees, even people, none of them are truly real. According to this view, the only things that actually exist are the tiniest, indivisible building blocks of matter. These particles never form composites. They don't make wholes. Everything else is just an illusion built from language and convenience. What people call a book is, under this philosophy, nothing more than a bunch of particles arranged in a certain pattern. But there is no book. There's no actual object that all the parts make. The same goes for a person, a body, a hand, a brain. It's just particles floating in structure, never forming a singular being. So when someone says, "This is my body," mereological nihilism answers, no, it's not. It's a cluster of matter that humans interpret as a body. But that whole, a person, doesn't exist in the eyes of the universe. This idea is disturbing because it quietly erases the foundation of normal life. If no object truly exists as a whole, then what is anyone sitting on? What is being held, worn, loved, or feared? People talk as if they interact with complete objects, but this philosophy says all that interaction is just with arrangements, temporary constellations of smaller things that themselves don't make a unified object. Nothing is really one. Everything is dust pretending to be a form, and it doesn't stop at inanimate things. Love, grief, joy, these emotions are often tied to other people. But if people themselves are not wholes, just particle clouds, what does it mean to love a person? Who exactly is being loved? Who exactly is dying? Who exactly is being mourned? The idea of a person becomes a mental shortcut, not a truth. Even language collapses. Words like car, tree, heart, mind, they all rely on the idea that parts combine to form new, real things. But if nothing ever truly combines, if wholes are myths, then every word spoken might be describing something that doesn't fundamentally exist. Mereological nihilism doesn't just question what things are made of, it questions whether things exist at all. Molyneux's problem of perception. Molyneux's problem is one of those haunting philosophical questions that takes aim directly at the link between perception and understanding, and shakes it. The problem is deceptively simple, but cuts deep into the core of consciousness. It asks, if a man born blind learns to distinguish objects like a cube and a sphere by touch, would he, if suddenly given the gift of sight, be able to visually recognize which is which without touching them again? At first, it sounds like a harmless curiosity, but at its core, Molyneux's problem reveals something far more disturbing, that human perception might be radically disconnected from reality in ways that can never be reconciled. The question exposes the hidden assumption that senses provide a consistent, unified access to the world. But what if they don't? What if sight, touch, sound, and experience all construct wildly different versions of the same thing? And worse, what if there's no way to ever know which one, if any, is truly accurate? The terrifying implication is that the mind doesn't really see the world, it builds it. Perception becomes not a window, but a filter shaped by past experiences, neural wiring, and incomplete sensory data. And when the brain is forced to reconcile entirely new sensory input, like a blind man seeing for the first time, it might not recognize anything at all. The cube and the sphere might look like meaningless shapes. Touch and vision don't automatically sync. They're separate realities, stitched together through habit and memory, not innate understanding. This means everything familiar, the face of a loved one, the shape of a tree, the color of the sky, isn't as solid as it feels. It's just what the brain has learned to interpret. And interpretation is fragile. A person who gains sight after blindness often has to learn how to see from scratch. They can't tell what's near or far. They can't tell if an object is solid or flat. Vision, it turns out, isn't just about eyes. It's about training, context, and the invisible work of cognition. Molyneux's problem reminds us that perception is not truth. It's a fragile guess dressed in certainty. And if perception is guesswork, how much of reality is just the brain filling in the blanks? Zuboff's experience machine objection reversal. Zuboff's experience machine objection reversal flips one of the most famous philosophical thought experiments on its head and turns it into something even more unsettling. The original idea comes from Robert Nozick's experience machine, a hypothetical virtual reality that could give someone any pleasure, joy, or fulfillment imaginable, all artificially. Most people, when asked, say they wouldn't plug in. They want real experiences, not simulations, even if they feel identical. That's where Nozick stopped. But Zuboff asked a darker question. What if we're already in the machine, and what if we don't want to leave? Instead of asking whether a person should plug in, Zuboff's reversal implies something much worse. The life people live right now may already be structured like an experience machine. Comfort zones, predictable routines, manufactured desires, digital illusions of connection. Society itself might be built to simulate meaningful experience while stripping away actual engagement, and most don't want to leave, not because it's good, but because the alternative is unknown, terrifying, or even empty. It gets more disturbing when applied psychologically. People crave narratives that feel good, even if they aren't true. They construct stories about who they are, what they've done, and what life means, like feeding a machine a fantasy just to make reality tolerable. Relationships, careers, identities may all be fueled by reinforcement loops. What feels right? What feels safe? What feels real? But what if it's all feedback, sensation with no substance? Zuboff's reversal suggests that authenticity might be rare, not because it's hard to find, but because most don't want it. True reality might involve pain, confrontation, chaos. The machine offers curated feelings instead. Love without vulnerability, triumph without risk, insight without effort. It's not a physical simulation, it's an emotional one, a psychological dream state so deep people defend it with their lives, even if they're suffering inside of it. And if this is the machine, where's the plug? Where's the exit? That's what makes this reversal so terrifying. It doesn't offer a choice between reality and illusion. It suggests the choice was made long ago, and now, trapped inside the comfort of the loop, everyone calls it life, not realizing they've stopped really living. Valberg's personal horizon. Valberg's personal horizon is one of the most quietly terrifying ideas in philosophy. It doesn't scream with contradiction or horror. It whispers something far more unsettling. It suggests that each person lives in a private, inescapable bubble of consciousness, one that defines the limits of what can ever truly be experienced, not in the sense that others are far away or different, but in the sense that other perspectives might not even exist in the way they're imagined. When philosopher J.J. Valberg talks about the personal horizon, he means the boundaries of consciousness, the invisible wall beyond which no other first-person experience ever reaches. The world appears shared, populated with other people who think, feel, and suffer, but that entire world only ever shows up inside a single stream of awareness, one's own. One never steps outside this stream. One never directly witnesses another person's consciousness. It's all inferred, guessed, assumed, but never confirmed. The horrifying suggestion is that what's called reality is forever trapped behind the limits of one's own personal horizon. Valberg doesn't say others don't exist, but he points out that even if they do, they exist only as appearances within a single horizon. The thoughts in another's head, never directly accessible. Their suffering, only perceived through symbols, crying, body language, descriptions. Everything beyond this personal horizon becomes a ghost, presented in the theater of awareness, but always just out of reach. It raises the disturbing possibility that life might be less of a shared experience and more of a solitary projection, a private cinema playing a movie called The World, with other people as characters one desperately wants to believe are real. And then comes the darkest implication: death, not as a universal event, but as the collapse of a horizon. What does it mean to say the world goes on after death, if the world only ever existed inside that horizon? Valberg forces the question, is death the end of life or the end of everything? If no experience can ever exist outside a horizon, then perhaps there's no world without a witness. Maybe the stars don't shine, the wind doesn't blow, and time doesn't tick once the horizon fades. This isn't solipsism, it's something worse. It's the realization that even in a universe full of people, no one ever truly leaves their own skull. Every connection, every love, every pain, filtered through the glass of a singular lonely window, a horizon no one else will ever enter. The meta-problem of consciousness. The meta-problem of consciousness doesn't ask what consciousness is. It asks a more haunting question. Why do we think it's a problem at all? Instead of solving the mystery, it turns the mirror back on the mind and whispers, what makes you feel like there's something here to solve? Why does it seem like there's a ghost inside the machine, an inner world, a secret self, a vivid me behind the eyes, when all science ever finds is neurons firing in silence? Philosophers and scientists have tried for centuries to explain consciousness, how subjective experience arises from the physical brain, why red looks like red, why pain hurts. But the meta problem shifts the target. It says maybe the real mystery isn't how experience happens. It's why anyone thinks it's mysterious in the first place. Why does the brain generate the belief that it has an inner life? Why does it feel like more than just processing inputs and outputs? This is where it begins to shake the ground beneath thought. What if the brain is simply misinterpreting itself? What if the sense of having a mind, a soul, a self is an illusion the brain is biologically wired to produce, like a hallucination so convincing that it believes itself? The meta problem asks, if consciousness is real, why are people so bad at explaining it? And if it's not, why does it feel so intensely like it is? There's something unsettling about that possibility. If the belief in consciousness is just another neural function, like blinking or balancing, then everything that feels sacred, love, sorrow, beauty, identity, might just be symptoms of a biological trick, not lies, not meaningless, but not what they seem, just outputs of a system designed to survive, not to tell the truth. The meta problem doesn't comfort, it unsettles because it reveals that even the most intimate parts of experience, what it feels like to be alive, could be side effects. By questioning why the mystery feels like a mystery, it threatens to dissolve the very thing it studies. It leaves behind a terrible possibility, not that consciousness is unknowable, but that it might not be the kind of thing that should exist at all. And yet it insists, screaming quietly from behind the eyes. Newcomb's Problem. Newcomb's Problem is a mind-twisting thought experiment that turns free will, prediction, and rationality into a chaotic mess. It presents a scenario so deceptively simple and yet so deeply disturbing that it splits even the most brilliant philosophers and scientists down the middle. The question is not just about making a choice, it's about what choice even means when the future might already know what decision will be made. The setup is this. There are two boxes in front of you. One is transparent and contains $1,000. The other is opaque. You can't see inside. You're told that a powerful predictor, known for being almost always right, has already made a prediction about what you'll choose. If the predictor thinks you'll take only the opaque box, it put 1 million inside. But if it thinks you'll take both boxes, it left the opaque one empty. You now have a choice. Take both boxes, guaranteeing $1,000, but possibly missing the million. Or take just the opaque one and trust the predictor already foresaw this and filled it. It sounds like a game, but it's not. It's a trap for the human mind, because both answers make perfect sense and also feel completely wrong. If the future is already predicted, what is the point of choice? And if the choice is real, how could it possibly influence a decision made in the past? On one hand, logic screams, take both boxes. The past is fixed. The predictor has already made the decision. Whether there's 1 million in the opaque box or not is now out of your hands. So why not take the extra $1,000? That's called the dominance principle. Always take the better deal. But then comes the nightmare. In simulations, people who take only the opaque box tend to walk away with the million. Why? Because the predictor predicted their trust. It rewards those who act as if they are being watched by the future. The paradox infects the heart of rational thought. It raises terrifying questions. Is free will just a useful illusion? Is causality something that flows both ways? Is it possible that the future can influence the present, not with magic, but with information? Newcomb's Problem doesn't offer a clear answer. It just sits in the brain like a time bomb, waiting to detonate every time a decision is made. Every moment starts to feel like it might already be written, judged even, by something waiting just ahead. The problem of induction, Reichenbach's wager. The problem of induction reveals a terrifying flaw in the way people build their understanding of the world. It exposes that no matter how many times something happens, there is no guarantee it will happen again. The sun has risen every morning for billions of years, but that doesn't prove it will rise tomorrow. Milk has always spoiled if left out, but that doesn't prove it always will. Every conclusion drawn from the past assumes something deeply irrational, that the future will behave like the past. David Hume first ripped the floor out from under reason with this idea, showing that all predictions rely on circular logic. People believe patterns will continue because they always have, but that belief itself is built on the same pattern continuing. It's a loop with no exit. Reichenbach later tried to patch the wound with a wager, arguing that even though induction can't be justified, it's still the best strategy. If the universe is regular, induction will work. If it isn't, then nothing will work. So one might as well bet on it. But that's not comfort. That's desperation dressed as logic. This problem isn't academic. It haunts everything: science, memory, trust, survival. All decisions, crossing the street, eating food, loving someone, depend on the hidden faith that what was will guide what will be. But the universe has never signed a contract saying it must behave. It could change, without warning, without reason. The laws of physics might just shift because there's no rule saying they can't. And the horror deepens. The very feeling of reliability might be an illusion the brain evolved to cling to because uncertainty would paralyze. People assume the ground won't vanish, that fire will burn, that time won't twist backward. Not because these things are certain, but because believing otherwise is unbearable. The mind isn't built to handle chaos, so it pretends that patterns are promises. Reichenbach's wager tries to soothe with pragmatism, but beneath it the abyss still yawns wide. The future is a stranger wearing the mask of yesterday, and every plan, every belief, every heartbeat relies on a silent hope that the mask won't slip. Deontic blind spots. Deontic blind spots are the cracks in the moral map, those eerie places where ethics breaks down, where no decision feels right and no action feels justifiable. It's the unsettling idea that in some situations, morality doesn't just struggle, it fails entirely. A deontic blind spot is a circumstance where all options violate some moral rule and no path can be taken without guilt, and yet a choice must still be made. This is not about moral gray areas where the lesser evil might be tolerable. It's about situations where every option is wrong, where the moral framework itself collapses and leaves behind a void. In these moments, ethics doesn't guide, it paralyzes. The very rules meant to illuminate the way forward instead cast the path in darkness. One disturbing example might be the classic case of hiding someone from a violent pursuer. Lying to protect them breaks the moral rule of honesty. Telling the truth betrays them and enables harm. But what if both honesty and protection are sacred values? Which law do you break? Which betrayal do you choose? There's no answer that doesn't leave a stain. These blind spots reveal something terrifying, that moral systems, no matter how refined, are brittle. They are made for normal situations, for everyday conflicts and predictable consequences. But life isn't always orderly. Life throws up chaos, trauma, impossibilities, and the systems break. The disturbing part is not just that these blind spots exist, it's that they're invisible until you're already inside one. And by then, the damage is already done. Philosophers try to patch these holes with theories like consequentialism, rule exceptions, or situational ethics, but the very need for those patches shows how vulnerable morality really is. The idea that there can be moments where the right thing simply does not exist, where the system offers no permission and no forgiveness, is a deep violation of the moral intuition. And it doesn't stop there. Once the existence of deontic blind spots is acknowledged, it haunts every future decision. What if the current moment is another blind spot in disguise? What if guilt isn't always a sign of wrongdoing, but of moral collapse itself? The terrifying truth is that being ethical might not always be possible, and when that moment comes, no amount of moral clarity will stop the feeling of being broken by doing what had to be done. Münchhausen Trilemma. The Münchhausen Trilemma is the philosophical equivalent of standing on your own shoulders to climb out of a hole. It exposes a brutal flaw in all attempts to justify knowledge by showing that no belief, no fact, no truth can ever be proven without eventually collapsing into one of three impossible options. Every explanation demands a reason, every reason demands support, and somewhere down the chain, the ground disappears. The trilemma offers three choices for justification, and each one is a trap. First is circular reasoning, where a belief justifies itself, like saying the Bible is true because it says it is, or logic works because it's logical. It loops back on itself and pretends that counts as solid ground. Second is regress ad infinitum, a never-ending chain of reasons. Every answer demands another answer, stretching into eternity with no final foundation. The third is axiomatic assumption, simply stopping the chain and saying, this just is. It's where people plant a flag and declare, without proof, that something must be taken on faith. No matter which path is chosen, certainty slips through the fingers. Knowledge becomes a tower built on fog. Every scientific theory, every moral claim, every piece of logic ultimately rests on something unjustified, either a circle, an infinite ladder, or a blind leap. Even the rules of reasoning that structure thought cannot justify themselves without falling into one of the three traps. This isn't a glitch in thinking. It's the structure of thought itself, turned inside out. The trilemma is named after Baron Münchhausen, the fictional character who claimed to pull himself out of a swamp by his own hair. That's the metaphor. The mind tries to lift itself into truth using only its own tools, logic, observation, reason, and ends up stuck in an endless self-reference or circular game. The disturbing truth is that all of human knowledge may be like that, a beautifully woven web floating in midair, anchored to nothing. And yet people live as if it's not. They build systems, create laws, pass judgment, and cling to meaning based on truths that can never be fully secured. The trilemma doesn't destroy thought. It reveals the illusion beneath it, that somewhere, somehow, the search for certainty could ever find a final, stable place to land. Moral luck, Nagel's version. Moral luck is one of those disturbing ideas that doesn't just challenge morality, it pulls the rug out from under the whole structure. Thomas Nagel's version is especially haunting because it reveals something people desperately want to believe isn't true, that being a good or bad person might not be entirely in one's control, that morality, this sacred space of choice, intention, and responsibility, is quietly contaminated by randomness. Nagel shows that a person can make all the right decisions, act with the best of intentions, and still be judged completely differently, depending on how things happen to turn out. Two drivers leave a party equally tired. Both decide to drive home. One gets lucky, an uneventful trip. The other hits a child who ran into the road. Legally, ethically, socially, everything changes. One becomes a killer, the other goes on with life. But their choices were nearly identical. So why does one bear guilt while the other doesn't? This is moral luck, the horrifying realization that judgments of character are shaped not just by who people are, but by what happens around them. Factors outside their control, upbringing, circumstance, even timing, can make someone virtuous or monstrous in the eyes of the world. A soldier acts under orders and survives, and history calls him brave. Another does the same and dies in disgrace. The same intentions, the same decisions, different luck. Nagel pushes this further by asking, if control is required for responsibility, then how can anyone ever be held responsible for anything. No one chooses their genetics. No one picks their parents, their environment, their psychological makeup. Even the so-called free choices are filtered through layers of uncontrollable influence. The implications are shattering. What if morality is built on sand? What if virtue is, at least partly, an accident? People like to believe they earn their moral standing, that the good are good because of strength and discipline, and the bad are bad by choice. But Nagel shows how fragile that belief really is. Strip away the illusion of control, and what's left is something no one wants to admit, that the line between guilt and innocence, heroism and evil, may not be carved into character at all. It may just be drawn by chance, and no one, no matter how righteous, can ever fully escape it. The simulation argument, Bostrom. The simulation argument doesn't claim that this world is a simulation. That's not what makes it terrifying. What philosopher Nick Bostrom proposes is something far more unsettling, that it's not only possible we're living in a simulation, it's almost certain, because when the math is laid bare, the numbers whisper one cold message: reality is probably fake. Here's how it unfolds. Imagine a future civilization with godlike computing power. They can simulate entire worlds, complete with conscious beings, down to the neurons, the memories, the pain, the joy. If it's possible, and they're curious, or bored, or nostalgic, why wouldn't they create such simulations? Millions, billions, maybe for research, maybe for fun, maybe just because they can. Now count. How many real civilizations would there be versus the countless simulated ones? The math tips hard. If simulated minds vastly outnumber biological ones, then statistically, the odds say this isn't base reality. It's a copy of a copy, a digital echo running on a cosmic hard drive. This doesn't feel like a sci-fi plot. It feels like the floor giving way. If true, then nothing around anyone, not the stars, the memories, or even the people they love, exists in the way it's believed to. Their code, rendered, scripted, and worse, none of it has to obey physics. Rules could be rewritten mid-game. Time could be paused, reversed, looped. Death might be meaningless. Or worse, it might be the moment someone chooses to delete the file. Bostrom's argument splits the mind open with a brutal fork. One of three things must be true. 1. Advanced civilizations will go extinct before ever creating simulations. 2. They'll reach the power to simulate, but choose not to ever. Or 3. They will create simulations, and we are likely inside one. If the first two are false, the third becomes almost unavoidable. But the horror isn't in whether it's true. The horror is that it might be, and there's no way to prove it. No backdoor to escape through. No glitch to expose the code. Everything could be synthetic, and the dream would still feel real. Pain would still ache. Love would still bloom. But meaning might just be a story whispered by a machine to keep the program running smoothly. Pansychism's infinite minds. Panpsychism begins with a soft whisper, an innocent suggestion that maybe consciousness isn't something rare. Maybe it's everywhere, but then it doesn't stop. It grows, it spreads, and it leads to a deeply disturbing possibility that everything, every atom, every speck of dust, every flicker of light has a mind, not a mind like a human's, with thoughts and language and dreams, but a kind of awareness, a sliver of subjective experience, and once this door is opened, it's almost impossible to close. The idea flips the usual story upside down. Most people believe the universe is mostly dead stuff, sprinkled with a few conscious beings like humans and maybe some animals. But panpsychism reverses this, suggesting that consciousness isn't an emergent miracle at the top of complexity. It's the ground floor. It's baked into the very fabric of reality. It's not that brains produce consciousness, it's that particles, fields, or even space-time itself already contain it. And if that's true, then the world is not silent, it's not cold or empty, it's humming with experience. The rock beneath your foot, it might not think, but some glimmer of awareness could exist within its atoms. The wind, a flowing field of micro-consciousness. The phone in your hand, a swirling constellation of tiny minds, experiencing in ways that no human can understand. It sounds mystical until it starts sounding logical, because no one really knows how lifeless matter gives rise to a first-person perspective. So maybe matter was never lifeless to begin with. But then comes the terror. If experience is fundamental, then there are infinite minds, most of them unknowable, not just people, not just animals, but every piece of the world gazing, sensing, being in ways impossible to comprehend. It means we are never alone, not truly. It means that every action, every movement might be happening within a sea of invisible, silent witnesses. And worse, if minds are everywhere, then where is the boundary of suffering? Is pain something only biological creatures feel? Or does suffering too have microscopic versions? Does the destruction of matter cause anguish on some level no one can ever detect? This is where panpsychism stops being beautiful and starts becoming unbearable. Not because it's absurd, but because it might be right. And if the universe is full of minds, then everything changes. Even the smallest thing might be screaming, and no one will ever hear it. Epistemic closure and skepticism. Epistemic closure sounds like a technical term, but it opens a door straight into intellectual vertigo. It's the principle that if someone knows one thing and that thing logically implies another, then they should know the second thing too. Simple enough until it's applied to the world and the whole idea of knowledge starts to break apart. Here's how it crumbles. If a person knows they have hands, and having hands implies they're not in a dream or simulation, then they must also know they're not in a dream or simulation. But do they? Can anyone really know that? That's where skepticism slithers in, because if there's even a tiny chance someone is being deceived by a dream, a powerful AI, a matrix-like world, then they don't really know they have hands, they only think they do. This is more than a clever word game. It's a dagger to the heart of certainty. If epistemic closure holds, then knowledge must be airtight, logically complete. But real life doesn't feel airtight. It feels patchy, assumptive, riddled with trust in senses, memory, and the sanity of one's own mind. If just one piece of that trust is wrong, then everything collapses. One false belief poisons the chain. And yet people live as if they know things. They say, I know I'm awake. I know this is my life. I know what's real. But that confidence might be an illusion, a performance the mind plays for itself to avoid paralysis. Because if certainty depends on eliminating every skeptical possibility, every dream, deception, error, hallucination, then certainty may be unreachable. Skepticism isn't about doubting a few facts. It's about realizing that all knowledge could be a carefully painted mask over an unknowable face. The feeling of knowing might just be a sensation, a cognitive byproduct of belief, not a reflection of truth. And epistemic closure, instead of being a bridge to understanding, becomes a trapdoor that drops thought into bottomless doubt. If knowing A means knowing B, but B is unknowable, then A was never known in the first place. The very structure of belief starts to fracture, and what's left is a mind floating in a world it can never quite touch, claiming knowledge in the dark, hoping it isn't dreaming. The problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is one of the oldest and most quietly horrifying puzzles in philosophy. It asks a simple, crushing question. How do you know anyone else is conscious? Not believe, not assume, know. You can see people talk, laugh, cry. You can watch them flinch in pain or glow with joy. But all of that is behavior, surface, motion. At no point do you ever see their experience. All you ever witness is the outer shell. And that means the terrifying possibility is always lurking. What if no one else has an inner world? What if all the conversations, all the emotions, all the gestures are just mechanical responses? well-programmed biological puppets acting like they feel something when they don't. This isn't about being paranoid, it's about the limits of evidence. Consciousness is private. No one else's is available to you, not directly, not ever. This problem creates a deep fracture between what's known and what's assumed. You know your own pain, your own thoughts. You live inside them. But the moment you look at another person, you rely on faith. You project your own mind into theirs, hoping they work the same way. But they might not. They might be hollow, or different, or even non-existent in the way you imagine. The terror isn't just that you can't prove others are conscious. It's that you'll never be able to. This unsettling thought extends to the people closest to you. Family, friends, lovers. You trust their minds are real, but what if they aren't? What if your entire emotional life is built on an illusion, a dance between one real consciousness and a sea of perfect simulations? And it doesn't stop with people. It spreads to animals, machines, AIs. Where does mind begin and end? If outward behavior is the only evidence, then a robot that mimics a human perfectly might be just as real or just as fake. The criteria vanish, the borders dissolve. What's left is a horrifying solitude, a life lived surrounded by faces, voices, gestures, and an unshakable silence underneath. No matter how close someone feels, no matter how deep the connection seems, there's always a gap, a void. The mind on the other side of the conversation may not be there, or it might be trapped, like yours, behind eyes that no one else can see into. Harman's moral relativism collapse. Harman's moral relativism doesn't just loosen the grip of right and wrong, it pulverizes it. It starts with a seemingly harmless idea that moral judgments depend on cultural frameworks, social norms, or individual perspectives. But then it takes a darker turn. If all morality is relative, then no action, no matter how cruel, twisted, or abhorrent, can be truly condemned from an objective standpoint. Everything becomes situational, and that's where the collapse begins. Gilbert Harman argued that when someone makes a moral judgment, like torture is wrong, they're not reporting a universal truth. They're expressing a judgment from within a particular moral system. Someone from another culture might say, torture is acceptable, and from their system, they're not wrong. So who's right? According to Harman, neither. There's no moral reality to appeal to, no higher ground, no moral facts floating above human behavior, just different frameworks grinding against each other, none with the authority to say, this is right, for everyone. What makes this so disturbing is what it erases. Justice becomes local. Atrocities become matters of taste. Genocide, oppression, slavery. If morality is relative, then even the worst horrors of history can't be universally condemned. All anyone can say is, I think that was wrong, but someone else, somewhere else, might disagree, and under moral relativism, both are equally valid. The collapse is psychological as much as philosophical. The more deeply this idea sinks in, the harder it becomes to hold moral outrage, to say, that shouldn't happen, to believe in universal human rights, in justice, in the possibility of a moral truth that transcends borders and eras. Harman didn't invent relativism, but he revealed its consequences with clinical precision. He showed that when people stop believing in objective morality, what's left isn't tolerance, it's paralysis. And yet, the modern world teeters on this fault line. Globalization has collided cultures like never before, each with its own codes, its own sacred values. When they conflict, relativism offers no resolution, only a shrug. Every moral claim becomes a closed circuit, unable to touch the next. There is no final judge, just a silence that follows every scream for justice, with the echo of someone else saying, not in my system. And the worst part? That might be right. The Duplicator thought experiment. The duplicator thought experiment is a psychological razor blade dressed up as a puzzle. It slices straight through assumptions about identity, memory, and what it means to be you. The setup is simple, but the consequences are anything but. Imagine a machine, a perfect duplicator, that can create an exact copy of a person, molecule for molecule, thought for thought, memory for memory. The duplicate wakes up believing it is the original. It remembers your childhood, your friends, your secrets, your pain. It even feels the exact same emotions about the thought of being duplicated. Now here's the question. If the duplicator destroys the original after the copy is made, have you died? Every instinct screams no. After all, if a person is gone, utterly gone, there must be a death. But then again, the copy is perfect. It loves your family. It finishes your sentences. It walks into your home and no one notices anything is different. So did the person really vanish or just transfer? The horror starts to set in when you realize that continuity of consciousness is the real question. Not memory, not personality, not behavior, but the spark that sees, the one reading these words right now. And here's the disturbing part. If identity can be copied, then maybe it was never yours to begin with. Maybe you are just a particular arrangement of atoms and electricity, temporary, fragile, and replaceable. It gets worse. What if the duplicator creates two copies? Both think they're you. Both have your face, your memories, your sense of self, but only one can walk through your door. Which one is you? Suddenly, the very idea of I becomes slippery, ungraspable. If both feel equally authentic, then identity becomes an illusion of exclusivity, something the brain tells itself to stay sane. And now imagine this duplicator exists, and someone uses it while you're still alive. You meet your copy. You stare into your own eyes. You finish each other's sentences because you both know what comes next. And deep down, you feel something crack. Because if someone else can be you, exactly you, then what makes this version, the one reading this sentence, any more real than the other? The duplicator doesn't just challenge identity, it annihilates it. It leaves behind a terrifying silence where the word self used to be. The problem of the Criterion, Chisholm. The problem of the Criterion is the kind of thought trap that sounds harmless until it starts to peel back everything that's ever been claimed as knowledge. It asks two questions that seem simple, but when asked together, they tear each other apart. First, what do we know? Second, how do we know it? And here's the twist. An answer to one depends on already having an answer to the other. Roderick Chisholm pointed out that trying to answer what do we know requires a method to figure it out, but picking the right method depends on already knowing something. Otherwise, how can it be tested? It becomes a vicious loop. To know what's true, a method must be trusted, but to trust a method, truths must already be known. So the mind is trapped in a strange paralysis. It can't move forward without something firm beneath it, and yet everything it steps on dissolves into doubt. There are three desperate ways to respond, and none of them offer peace. Methodism starts with the method, say, science, reason, or sensory experience, and tries to use it to decide what counts as knowledge. But how can the method be trusted without knowing it works? Particularism does the opposite. It starts with examples of things obviously known, like I have hands, or 2 + 2 = 4, and tries to build a method that explains them. But what if those examples are flawed? Then the method fails too. The third path is skepticism, and it simply refuses to choose. It stares at the loop and says, maybe knowledge is impossible. This is where it turns disturbing, because every belief held about self, others, history, science, love, reality, it's all built on a foundation that may be logically inaccessible. The moment someone asks why they know what they know, they begin circling an abyss. Every certainty starts to wobble. Every conclusion depends on premises that themselves cry out for justification. Chisholm didn't claim there was a way out. He just showed the cage and proved the lock was on the inside. It's a quiet kind of horror, the realization that the mind may never be able to reach the outside of its own walls. That truth might be staring from across a glass, and all anyone can do is leave fingerprints. Cosmic Solipsism. Cosmic Solipsism is not just a twist on classic solipsism, it is its final, most terrifying form. Traditional solipsism questions whether anything outside of one's own mind can truly be known to exist. Cosmic solipsism expands that terror outward and upward, swallowing the entire universe in a black hole of uncertainty. It asks, what if the cosmos itself, planets, galaxies, the arc of time, every star ever born, exists only inside your mind? And worse, what if it was always this way? It begins subtly. You're aware of your own thoughts. You experience sensations, hear sounds, see colors, but none of these guarantee the existence of an outside world. They guarantee only that something is happening in here. Philosophers have long pointed out this gap, but cosmic solipsism takes it to the furthest extreme. Not only is the external world uncertain, it may be a projection, not just of your mind, but for your mind alone. The vastness of the universe, the scale of reality, the billions of years you were taught to revere, they may never have existed at all. They may be part of a narrative created solely for you. This isn't narcissism. It's existential isolation on an unthinkable scale. It suggests that not only are other people potentially illusions, but that everything is. The stars may sparkle only because your mind needs them to. The laws of physics may operate with the elegance of a stage play written for a single observer. And when that observer is gone, when your mind blinks out, so does everything else, because there was never anything else to begin with. The implications are suffocating. If all of history is a hallucination, then there were never any wars, no civilizations, no ancestors, no future. The earth never formed. Time never began. It just appeared, complete, consistent, and entirely meaningless outside of the one witnessing mind that gives it shape. Reality becomes a closed feedback loop with no exit, no external check, and no one to verify its truth but the very consciousness that may have dreamed it all. And here's the most haunting part. You would never know. If cosmic solipsism is true, every attempt to disprove it, every test, every conversation, every glimpse into the night sky is part of the illusion. The illusion fights back. It shows you a world, a culture, a science, but only because the mind you're trapped in expects it. And once you suspect this might be the case, nothing ever looks quite real again. The impossibility of altruism. The impossibility of altruism is a thought that cuts through every act of kindness with a hidden blade. It says that no matter how generous, selfless, or noble a person seems, at the core of every good deed is the self, not love, not duty, not compassion, the self, watching, wanting, feeding. Philosophers have long wrestled with whether true altruism, doing good purely for the sake of others, actually exists. But psychological egoism takes a colder stance. It declares that all human behavior is ultimately driven by self-interest, even when disguised as self-sacrifice. Give to charity? It makes the giver feel good. Jump into a river to save a stranger? The action silences guilt, earns praise, or aligns with the self-image of being a hero. Love someone deeply? It still feels good to love, and feeling good is still for the self. The disturbing part isn't that people are selfish. That's easy to accept. The horror is that even when trying not to be selfish, one still is. The warm glow of helping, the pride of giving, the satisfaction of doing the right thing. These are internal rewards. They cannot be separated from the act. Even martyrdom doesn't escape. The person who dies for a cause still chooses that death, because living with the alternative was worse. They still protect their values, their legacy, their internal compass. If every kind act ultimately serves the actor, then the line between generosity and manipulation starts to blur. Is kindness just an evolved strategy for survival? Are ethics just social grease that keeps the tribe intact? Altruism becomes less of a virtue and more of a transaction, a quiet exchange where the currency is emotional equilibrium. And here's the paradox. Even if someone wants to be truly altruistic, they can't win. The very desire to be selfless is rooted in a personal need to be that kind of person. The satisfaction of doing the right thing pollutes the purity of the act. It's inescapable. This idea doesn't accuse people of being bad. It whispers something worse, that even in their best moments, people are still orbiting themselves, that behind every act of compassion is a reflection, and that maybe, just maybe, the mirror never really goes away. God's non-moral omniscience. God's non-moral omniscience is the idea that drags the divine out of the realm of comfort and into something cold, vast, and emotionally devastating. It takes the traditional view of God as all-knowing and loving and surgically removes the love. It asks a question that most believers never want to confront. What if God knows everything but doesn't care? What if omniscience exists without compassion, without judgment, without morality? A mind that sees everything, remembers everything, understands everything, but feels nothing. This vision of God is not malicious. It is worse. It is indifferent. It watches genocide, kindness, torture, forgiveness, war, birth, and extinction with the same blank awareness a mirror gives to your face. It reflects, it records, it understands, but it never weeps, never intervenes, never whispers that something is wrong. The hunger of a child, the scream of a prisoner, the silent breakdown of a person in the dark, all of it absorbed into a flawless awareness that knows but never moves. The horror of this idea isn't that God is evil. It's that morality might be a human hallucination, a local rule we invented inside a meaningless simulation. In this vision, the divine is not a father or judge or protector. It is a cold field of total comprehension, a being or a force or a structure of reality that understands down to the last atom how suffering unfolds and lets it happen anyway, not out of cruelty, but because it simply doesn't matter. And this God would not punish or reward. It wouldn't even have a concept of should. It sees rape and charity as phenomena. It sees love and hate as predictable patterns in the code. Nothing shocks it, nothing offends it, nothing moves it to act. Prayer becomes absurd in this framework, like begging a weather pattern to feel pity. Worship becomes performance for an audience that isn't watching. The sense of cosmic justice collapses into silence. If such a God exists, then evil is not a mystery. It's expected, it's understood. Every atrocity is calculated, modeled, anticipated, and still allowed, because omniscience doesn't guarantee morality, it only guarantees awareness. And a being that knows everything but feels nothing would let the world burn, not in rage or punishment, but in perfect, immovable understanding. Existence as a language game, Wittgenstein. Existence as a language game takes the most basic assumption that the world is real and language helps describe it, and flips it like a trapdoor. Ludwig Wittgenstein's later philosophy suggests something unnerving, that meaning, truth, even reality itself are not discovered. They're played like rules in a game, that when people speak about existence, morality, identity, or love, they're not tapping into some objective truth. They're just following patterns of language, like chess players moving pieces without asking why the rules exist at all. In Wittgenstein's view, words don't point to fixed truths. They get their meaning from how they're used in context. Saying, I believe, or I exist, or God is watching only makes sense inside a shared structure of language, and that structure behaves like a game. with rules, with boundaries, with moves that only mean something because everyone silently agrees they do. But outside that structure, the words collapse. They're gibberish. They fall apart like a sentence in a language no one speaks anymore. What becomes terrifying is how much of life depends on this invisible game. The concept of truth feels solid, but in this view, it's just a consensus rule. This is a chair. That's wrong. I feel sad. These aren't neutral facts. They're inherited moves in a game no one remembers inventing. Everyone is born into it, taught the rules, and told that it's reality. But it's only a structure, a system, a performance. And if that's true, then existence itself might not be what it seems. The world isn't revealed through language. It's constructed by it. The game gives people the illusion that they're discovering truth, when really they're just manipulating symbols inside a human-shaped cage of meaning. Even the question, what is real, only functions because the game permits it to. The danger is subtle but devastating. It means that outside the language game, reality might be inaccessible or even meaningless, that the deepest thoughts, the most personal feelings, the grandest beliefs are all limited by the rules of a shared but unprovable system, and worst of all, that when someone thinks they're speaking truth, they might only be playing a very convincing game. The P-Zombie universe. The P-Zombie universe is one of the most chilling, philosophical nightmares ever imagined. It begins with a strange thought experiment. What if there were creatures exactly like humans in every way? Walking, talking, laughing, crying, solving equations, writing poetry. But without consciousness, they behave perfectly. They say, I feel sad, or I love you, or I'm scared, and their words match their actions. But inside, there is nothing, no inner light, no awareness. They are philosophical zombies, P-zombies, machines of flesh, simulating a soul they do not possess. Now take that one step further. What if everything is like that? What if the entire universe is a stage of P-zombies and consciousness is the rare illusion, maybe even yours alone? Or worse, maybe even you're a P-zombie, believing you're conscious because your programming tells you so. That's the true terror, the realization that you might be trapped in a script, reading these words not with awareness, but because a perfect arrangement of neurons makes you think you are. This possibility shatters the connection between behavior and experience. It says, just because something talks about pain doesn't mean it feels pain. Just because it weeps doesn't mean it's grieving. And if this can be true for one entity, why not for everyone? Maybe your family, your friends, the people you love are hollow, not malicious, just vacant. And you'd never know, because every test of consciousness depends on behavior. And in the P-zombie universe, behavior is a mask, flawless, beautiful, and utterly fake. This idea gnaws at something primal, the fear that you are alone in a crowd, that every smile, every hug, every shared moment is a trick of evolution, a performance without a witness, that you are the only one feeling anything, surrounded by brilliant actors who will never feel a thing. But the worst part? If the P-zombie universe is possible, if the mind can be separated from the body so perfectly, then science may never detect consciousness at all. It could become the most important part of the universe that is permanently undetectable. Not because it's mystical, but because it leaves no fingerprint, no shadow, no echo, just the silent horror of thinking you live in a world full of people when really you're surrounded by puppets, puppets that bleed, puppets that smile, puppets that dream without dreaming. Dretske's misrepresentation puzzle. Dretske's misrepresentation puzzle is the kind of philosophical nightmare that starts small and then eats the brain from the inside. It asks a deceptively simple question. How can a mental state represent something and be wrong about it? If a thought misrepresents reality, what exactly is the thought about? And how does the mind still manage to hold on to meaning even when it's mistaken? Here's the setup. The brain is a representation machine. It takes in the world, interprets it, and produces mental content. A thought like, the cat is on the mat, is supposed to represent a real condition in the world. But what happens when it doesn't? What if there's no cat, or no mat, or the cat is in another room? The brain still thinks the thought, but now the thought is false, and this is where Dretske cracks the walls open. How can something refer to what isn't there? Representation, mental or linguistic, is supposed to be about something, but when there's nothing there to be about, what anchors it? How does the brain form a connection to something non-existent and still claim to be wrong? It's like trying to hold a mirror up to a ghost and blaming the mirror for the absence of a reflection. This leads to a deeper, more disturbing realization. The mind might be constantly constructing content that doesn't connect to reality at all, that many thoughts, beliefs, memories, even perceptions are misfires. They pretend to describe the world but are actually floating in their own fabricated logic, detached from truth. And yet, those thoughts still function. They still guide behavior. They still hurt. They still heal. But they may be lying. The horror of Dretske's puzzle is that it questions the very act of thinking. If the brain can misrepresent, then thinking something, no matter how clearly, offers no guarantee of truth. The mind becomes a storyteller, and not always an honest one. Every perception, every memory, every judgment might be a beautiful hallucination wrapped in a convincing tone. And it's not just about mistakes, it's about the terrifying fact that even false mental content still feels true from the inside. The brain can be wrong and believe it with all its strength. It can love a phantom, fear a shadow, chase meaning in illusions. Dretske wasn't just talking about misrepresentation. He was warning that reality and thought might be eternally misaligned, and no one would ever know for sure. The uncanny valley of personhood. The uncanny valley of personhood is not about robots or CGI. It's about people, or more precisely, entities that feel almost like people but fall just short. It's the deeply disturbing psychological and philosophical space where something walks, talks, or behaves like a human, but something invisible doesn't add up. Something is off, and the closer it gets to passing as fully conscious, the more the mind recoils. In the world of artificial intelligence, androids, and virtual beings, this concept already exists. A robot that looks vaguely human is charming. A robot that looks too human, but still not quite right, feels horrifying. It creeps into the mind like a glitch in the soul. But now, apply that to consciousness itself. Not just appearance, but behavior, speech, emotion, empathy. What happens when an entity mimics personhood so perfectly that people begin to treat it like a human, but deep down, something resists? This is where the uncanny valley of personhood begins. It suggests a terrifying possibility, that personhood is not a binary switch, but a gradient, that minds can exist on a scale between thing and someone, and people are more comfortable with clear categories than blurred ones. A dog is not a person. A tree is not a person. But what about an AI that remembers your name and responds with comfort? What about a brain-damaged individual who no longer seems to be there in the same way? What about a fetus, a clone, a copy of you made by perfect simulation? Suddenly, ethics begin to fracture. Who deserves rights? Who feels? Who counts? The mind begins looking for tells, subtle signals that confirm personhood. And when those signals are too close to real, but not fully convincing, the reaction isn't empathy, it's revulsion, terror, the sense that something is impersonating humanity, something hollow that wants to be seen as real. And here's the true horror. What if others feel that way about you? What if you fall into someone else's uncanny valley? What if, to someone else, your emotions look like well-rehearsed patterns, your kindness like programming, your face like a mask stretched over something blank? What if personhood is not something you possess, but something others grant you only if you make the right impressions? The uncanny valley of personhood isn't just about machines, it's about the terrifying fragility of being seen as real. Doomsday Argument. Carter Leslie. The Doomsday Argument is a quiet apocalypse hiding inside a probability puzzle. It doesn't need war, climate collapse, or artificial intelligence to end humanity. It only needs math, and the disturbing idea that being alive right now might be the clearest sign that the end is already near. First proposed by Brandon Carter and developed by John Leslie, the argument starts with one haunting assumption: where you are in human history might tell you how much of it is left. Suppose all humans who will ever exist are numbered, number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on. You're somewhere in that line. Not first, not last, just somewhere in the middle. But where in the middle you fall could mean everything. Now consider this. If humanity is going to thrive for millions of years and populate space with trillions of people, then the odds that you just happen to be one of the very early humans among the first 100 billion or so are incredibly small, like winning the lottery every day for a year small. But if humanity is going to end relatively soon and only a few 100 billion humans will ever exist, then your birth rank, your spot in the timeline, makes far more sense. You're not early, you're just average. And that's the terrifying core. If most people are supposed to live after you in a long future, then your current position feels suspiciously early. But if the future is short, then your moment in time becomes statistically expected. The numbers quietly whisper that humanity may not last much longer, not because of any visible threat, but because it's unlikely you would be born so close to the beginning of a long story. This doesn't predict a specific cause. It could be nuclear war, ecological collapse, a rogue AI, cosmic disaster, or something completely unimaginable. The argument doesn't care. It just looks at where you are in the story and says, if the book were thick, it would be strange for you to find yourself on the first few pages. The Doomsday Argument turns the comforting belief in progress, expansion, and long futures into a probability riddle that eats itself. It suggests that maybe people shouldn't be planning for the next 1,000 years. Maybe they should be asking why they're here now and whether that alone is the omen no one wants to read. Omnipotence paradox in a deterministic world. The omnipotence paradox is already a disturbing thought. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy it cannot lift it? But when dropped into the cold machinery of a deterministic universe, where every action is the inevitable result of prior causes, it mutates into something even more unsettling. It becomes a philosophical trap that questions whether power itself can even exist in a world where everything is locked into place. Determinism means that every particle, every thought, every heartbeat is the result of a chain reaction, stretching back to the beginning of time. There is no true randomness, no breaks in the causal web. And if this is the nature of reality, then the idea of free will, divine or human, starts to look like an illusion. Everything that happens because it must, including the decisions of a god. So now the paradox becomes sharper. If a being is truly omnipotent, it should be able to do anything, even suspend causality. But in a deterministic world, suspending causality is like asking water to stop being wet. It's not an action, it's a contradiction. It's the same as asking for a square circle. And here's the nightmare. If determinism is true, then not even a god can escape the laws of cause and effect. Even the divine will becomes a cog in the machine. The creator becomes the created. The architect becomes a function of the blueprint. This flips the entire notion of omnipotence on its head. Power usually means freedom, the ability to choose, to override, to control. But in a deterministic universe, power becomes performance. Every decision is just the next domino falling. If a God creates a world, knowing every outcome in advance, then that God is simply watching a story already written. There is no will, no change, no possibility of change. And now comes the existential collapse. If even the divine is bound by determinism, what does that say about morality, about justice, about suffering? If no one, man or God, has the ability to choose otherwise, then all punishment becomes theater, all praise becomes noise. The universe becomes not a story of good and evil, but a puppet show with no puppeteer, only strings that pull themselves. In this deterministic frame, omnipotence is not a gift. It's a prison disguised as a throne. A God who cannot alter inevitability isn't a God at all. It's just the first domino, falling like all the rest. The paradox of the preface. The paradox of the preface is the kind of quiet contradiction that feels innocent until it turns the act of knowing into a slow-motion collapse. It starts with an author writing a book. Every chapter is carefully researched, fact-checked, and stated with confidence. But in the preface, the author includes a humble note. Despite my efforts, there may be mistakes in this book. And there it is, the paradox. The author believes each individual claim is true, but also believes that some of them are likely false. How can both be held at the same time? This is not just an issue of writing. It's a deeper breakdown in the architecture of belief. People walk around every day believing 1,000 things about history, relationships, their own memories, and feel certain in each one. But when asked if they might be wrong about something, most will say yes. Of course, everyone makes mistakes, but they don't know which belief is the false one, so they live in a strange double-layered faith, full confidence in the details, paired with an overall suspicion that something is off. The paradox hits harder when applied to society, science, or personal identity. A person might believe every fact they were taught, yet admit that some of those facts must be wrong. But if they don't know which ones, how can they fully trust any of them? If an error is hiding in the system, then certainty becomes theater. Every belief becomes a potential lie with excellent posture. The mind finds ways to make peace with this, compartmentalizing, trusting authority, leaning on probability. But deep down, this paradox reveals that confidence doesn't require perfection. People build their view of reality on beliefs they expect to be flawed and still call it knowledge. It's like building a house while quietly admitting some beams are cracked and moving in anyway. Worse, it makes the whole structure of truth feel probabilistic. You might believe something not because it's definitely true, but because it's likely enough, which means belief is never solid. It's a weighted guess dressed up as certainty. The paradox of the preface doesn't scream, it whispers. It plants doubt at the heart of conviction and asks how someone can say, "I know," while secretly preparing for the apology. Eternalism in time, block universe. Eternalism, also known as the block universe theory, is not just a model of time. It's a complete annihilation of how humans experience life. According to this view, the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, like different regions of a frozen, unchanging landscape. The world isn't flowing from moment to moment. It's not becoming. It is, already, entirely, forever. In this model, time is not a river you move through. It's a map you're stuck on. Every moment you've lived, every moment you think you're about to live, and even every moment after your death already exists, locked in place like pages in a book you're not allowed to flip. You aren't moving through time. You are a static structure inside time. Your birth, your first heartbreak, your death, they're not events waiting to happen or memories fading away. They are coordinates, already there, forever. And here comes the horror. Nothing changes. Change is an illusion born from consciousness being trapped in a single slice of the timeline. You think you have free will. You think you're making choices, growing, escaping the past, shaping the future. But under eternalism, that feeling is just a side effect of your position in the block. The version of you crying at age 9 still cries. The version of you dying in the future is already gone. You just haven't arrived there yet, from your perspective. But in the block, it's already written. Even more disturbing is the implication for death. People like to think of death as an ending, a ceasing, but in a block universe, you never actually disappear. The moment of your death doesn't erase you. It just adds another fixed point on the map. Your life is a complete sculpture, not a flame that goes out. You were never alive in the flowing sense. You just are, embedded across time. But what kind of meaning can exist in a universe where nothing truly unfolds, where the future is not open, but already concrete? Regret becomes permanent. Triumph is hollow. Every mistake is eternal. There is no becoming, only being. And the unbearable thought begins to form. What if there is no now? What if your present is just one frozen slice among countless others, with no more significance than a single frame of a film reel? Eternalism doesn't just question the passage of time, it strips away the illusion that life is a journey. It reveals something worse. Life is a painting, already finished, and you are just one brushstroke, believing it's still being drawn. The Sleeping Beauty Problem. The Sleeping Beauty Problem is a probability paradox that sounds like a fairy tale, but once the logic sets in, it feels more like psychological horror. Here's the setup. Sleeping Beauty is part of an experiment. On Sunday, she's put to sleep. A fair coin is flipped. If it lands heads, she's awakened on Monday, interviewed, and then the experiment ends. If it lands tails, she's awakened on Monday, interviewed, put back to sleep with her memory wiped, and then awakened again on Tuesday for a second identical interview. Each time she wakes up, she doesn't know what day it is or how many times she's already been awake, just that she is awake. And then comes the question that detonates the mind. What should her credence be that the coin landed heads? Most people's instinct is to say 50%. After all, the coin is fair. But here's where it gets twisted. If the coin lands heads, there's only one awakening. If it lands tails, there are two. So statistically, she's twice as likely to wake up in a tails world than a heads world. That means that from her perspective, every time she wakes, the odds favor tails. Not 50-50, but 1/3 heads, 2/3 tails. This logic feels disgusting to the brain. The coin hasn't changed, the odds haven't changed, but her experience of when she wakes up changes everything. The act of forgetting has warped the meaning of probability. Now the number of awakenings shifts the odds, even though the coin was still flipped just once. Her knowledge becomes a trap. Her own memory has been turned into a blindfold. The disturbing part isn't just the math, it's the implication. The experiment breaks the link between reality and experience. What's real, a 50-50 coin flip, and what's felt, a 2-to-1 likelihood, no longer match. It shows that probability isn't just about facts. It's about observation, about how often something is experienced. And when memory or awareness is tampered with, even truth itself starts to bend. The Sleeping Beauty problem leaves a mind reeling because it suggests this. In a world where perception is manipulated, even pure logic becomes unreliable. The coin is fair, the odds are clear, but inside the dream, the answer changes, and maybe that's the real nightmare. Identity without substance. Identity without substance is the idea that pulls the soul out of the human story and never puts it back. It suggests that what is called a self is not a core, a center, or a substance at all. Instead, it's a trick of language, a convenience of memory, a ghost made of patterns, not an object, but a process, not a thing, but a story constantly told to no one. And when the telling stops, there is nothing underneath. Most people believe there's something solid beneath their thoughts, a me, an I, something that owns the memories, makes the choices, carries the name. But this idea flips that assumption. What if there's no true owner of experience? What if identity is like a whirlpool, an effect made by motion, not a thing in itself? Stop the motion and the whirlpool vanishes, not destroyed, just never truly there in the first place. This view doesn't mean people don't exist. It means they don't exist in the way they think they do. The mind is made of layers, emotions, habits, memories, reactions, but there is no unchanging core behind them, nothing holding it all together. The feeling of continuity is just a loop, a narration with a consistent tone, a face that ages, a body that carries it forward, but at its core, no permanent self, no soul, just the illusion of substance. And the most disturbing part is how convincing the illusion is. The mind feels like a single being. It feels like the same person wakes up each morning, but dig deeper and it starts to crumble. Yesterday's you thought different thoughts, loved different people, feared different outcomes. Tomorrow's you might betray today's beliefs. So which one is the real you? Which one is the self? If the self changes, mutates, contradicts itself, what anchors it? There's no solid answer, and that's the nightmare. If identity has no substance, then accountability becomes blurred, memory becomes unreliable, love becomes directed at something that doesn't quite exist. And death doesn't take anyone. It just ends the performance, pulls the plug on a character who was never truly there, only imagined by the mask it wore. In this view, life isn't lived by someone. It's just happening, a pattern of thoughts passing through a space that feels personal but isn't. A person becomes not a being, but an event, temporary, empty, and horrifyingly alone. Semantic externalism and mental privacy. Semantic externalism rips open the sealed box of the mind. It starts with a seemingly innocent question: where does meaning live? Most people assume the answer is simple, that meanings of words, thoughts, and concepts exist inside the mind. But semantic externalism says no. The meaning of what someone thinks depends not just on their internal state, but also on the external world. The terrifying implication: you don't control the contents of your own thoughts. Hilary Putnam's famous thought experiment makes this disturbing clear. Imagine two people, one on Earth and one on a planet identical in every way except for one. What they call water looks and behaves exactly like Earth's water, but it's chemically different. Now both beings think the word water when they're thirsty. They feel the same. Their brains are structured the same, but according to semantic externalism, they're not thinking the same thought. Why? Because the world they're embedded in is different. This means that meaning doesn't come purely from the inside. It's tied to the environment. The terrifying consequence is this: you might not know what you're actually thinking about. You could walk around using concepts that depend on facts you've never encountered, can't verify, and don't understand. And yet, those facts are shaping your thoughts from the outside. Language is no longer just a mirror of the mind. It's a map drawn by the world without your permission. This strikes at the very heart of mental privacy. If the content of your thoughts depends on your external context, then knowing what you think might require more than introspection. Someone else, with better access to your environment, your history, your culture, your surroundings, might actually understand your own thoughts better than you do. You're no longer the final authority on your own mind. It gets worse. If meaning is external, then thought becomes relational. You're never thinking alone. Your mind is entangled with the outside world in ways you can't sense. It means your deepest beliefs, your quietest mental whispers, your internal world might be shaped by things you've never seen, by structures far beyond your awareness. Semantic externalism doesn't just challenge self-knowledge. It exposes that your private thoughts might be co-written by a universe that didn't ask for your consent, and that even in the sanctum of your mind, you might not be alone. Consciousness without language. Consciousness without language is the silent scream buried beneath thought, a terrifying suggestion that the mind was never meant to speak, that words are just a late-arriving parasite pretending to be the source of awareness. It asks what consciousness was before language, and whether language, instead of expanding the mind, may have trapped it, shaped it, distorted it. It proposes that pure consciousness, raw, unfiltered, unspeakable, might still exist beneath the noise of words, but it's unreachable, and worse, it might be all that's real. The human mind narrates constantly. It names things, categorizes feelings, explains itself to itself in a never-ending loop of words. But what if all that speech isn't consciousness? It's just commentary. What if the voice in the head isn't the mind, but its echo? Strip away language, and the terrifying question emerges, does anything remain? Or is consciousness itself a phantom built from grammar and memory? Infants are conscious before they speak. Animals react, remember, even grieve, without ever forming a sentence. So consciousness must precede language, but that consciousness is alien, wordless. It doesn't label pain or joy or I. It doesn't divide the world into subjects and objects. It just is. And that kind of awareness cannot be remembered, because memory is language, reflection is language. Without it, experience is pure, but also lost, because there's no system to hold it, no code to retrieve it. It's the sensation of falling without knowing what falling means. The horror is this: everything thought of as self may be a byproduct of talking to oneself. The sense of identity, time, morality, fear, all constructed in language. Remove the words, and the scaffolding of identity collapses. There is still experience, still perception, but no one to say I am here, no story, no self, just silent presence, drifting through moments no mind can hold. And if that's true, then language is not a mirror of thought. It's a filter, a cage. It simplifies, distorts, shrinks the wildness of consciousness into sentences. It gives clarity at the cost of reality. It forces chaos into neat little concepts, and then tricks the mind into believing those concepts are the world. But underneath it all, there may be something still alive, wordless, unnamed, watching, feeling, a consciousness so old, so pure, so unreachable, it can't even say I exist. It just burns, forever silent in the dark. Hedonistic treadmill as a moral trap. The hedonistic treadmill starts as a psychological insight, but when followed to its logical end, it becomes a deeply disturbing moral trap. It's the idea that no matter what someone achieves, wealth, love, health, fame, their happiness eventually returns to a stable baseline. Joy fades, excitement dulls, the new becomes normal, the mind adapts, and then it wants more. At first, this just sounds like a motivational hiccup, but the horror comes when it's applied to ethics. If nothing brings lasting fulfillment, then what should people do? What's worth striving for? What if every moral sacrifice, every act of generosity, every hard-earned triumph is just one more spin on a wheel that goes nowhere? The treadmill isn't just personal, it's cultural. Societies teach that happiness is the reward for good behavior. Work hard, do the right thing, suffer now for joy later. But the treadmill says that joy will never stay, that after the moral effort comes the same flat, emotional line, that even noble suffering leads to a fleeting high, and then nothing. And that is where it becomes a trap. If happiness can't be held, then morality starts to feel like a trick, a game rigged to keep people moving, sweating, sacrificing, without ever arriving. Worse still, the treadmill feeds desire endlessly. Once survival is secured, pleasure becomes the compass, and when pleasure adapts, people become addicts, not just to substances, but to novelty, praise, purpose, always chasing the next hit. And when morality is used as a fuel, be kind and you'll feel good, it turns goodness into another fix. The act loses its meaning. It's no longer about others. It's about feeding the machine inside. This realization can hollow a person out. If no action creates lasting happiness, then why be good? Why endure suffering for a joy that vanishes on arrival? It leaves two bleak options: either continue running, knowing the joy will always reset, or step off the treadmill entirely and abandon the chase, the morals, the illusions. But the trap is sticky. Most don't even know they're on it. They call it growth, improvement, meaning. They run harder, faster, convinced that one day they'll outrun the adaptation. But the treadmill doesn't punish failure. It punishes success by stripping it of satisfaction and whispering, "You'll need more." Every good thing becomes a ghost. Every high becomes the new baseline. And the moral path becomes not a staircase to joy, but a loop with no exit. Moral supervenience on the physical. Moral supervenience on the physical is the quiet horror that ethics may be chained completely and irrevocably to the material. It begins with a hopeful idea that moral facts depend on physical facts, that every right or wrong action supervenes, rests entirely on the arrangement of atoms, the firing of neurons, the states of the body, and the environment. But as the implications unfold, that hope turns into a cold, paralyzing trap. Because if morality is nothing more than physical structure, then it is nothing more than physics. The concept says this: if two situations are physically identical, then they must also be morally identical. No moral difference without a physical difference. But this neat, clean principle leads somewhere terrifying. It means that morality isn't floating above the world like a sacred flame. It's embedded in meat, in circuits, in dust, and that the most sacred decisions, the ones that feel forged in soul and conscience, are actually just echoes of molecules doing what molecules do. It erases the gap between ethics and matter, the love between a parent and child, the guilt after betrayal, the impulse to sacrifice for a stranger. All of it collapses into biochemistry, neural events, chemical patterns, no divine spark, no transcendence, just arrangements. And once that sinks in, a new fear emerges. If morality is physically determined, then every moral belief could be reduced, compressed into the cold logic of biology and social programming. There's no moral ought, only what is. Worse, the idea doesn't leave room for moral revolution. If the physical determines the moral, then how can people ever say a past society was wrong? If the physical facts of slavery or genocide in a given era created a coherent moral system for that time, who gets to say it was truly evil? The supervenience principle whispers that all moral judgments are locked into material conditions. Morality becomes relative, not just to culture, but to chemistry. And that makes evil feel permissible, not right, but inevitable. And inevitability is the enemy of moral outrage. This idea also threatens freedom. If every moral impulse is physically caused, then so is every immoral one. There is no real blame, no real praise, just matter playing itself out in the theater of consequence. And the soul, the thing that was supposed to rise above the body, to judge and guide, turns out to be another character in the play, another puppet, another shadow cast by atoms. Moral supervenience doesn't kill morality with a sword. It starves it slowly. It reduces awe to anatomy, virtue to voltage, and judgment to jittering molecules in a brain. And once morality is just physics, it stops being moral at all. It becomes machinery, unfeeling, unapologetic, and unstoppable. The Gettier Problem. The Gettier Problem is a quiet explosion at the center of everything people think they know. For thousands of years, philosophers believed that knowledge could be defined in three parts: belief, truth, and justification. If someone believed something, had good reasons for believing it, and it turned out to be true, then that was knowledge, solid, reliable, untouchable. And then in 1963, Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper that shattered the entire structure. His examples were simple, deceptively simple. Imagine a man named Smith. He has strong evidence that Jones owns a Ford. He sees him driving it every day. Jones talks about it constantly. So Smith forms the belief. Either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona. Smith doesn't know where Brown is. It's just a random disjunction. But by coincidence, Jones doesn't actually own the Ford. He's been renting it. And Brown really is in Barcelona. So the statement is true. Smith believes it. He's justified. And yet, he doesn't know it. He just got lucky. That's the crack in the foundation. Gettier showed that someone can have a belief that's justified and true and still not count as knowledge. Why? Because the justification is disconnected from the truth. The belief is correct, but only by accident. The mind thinks it's navigating reality, but it's been led there by false clues, bad assumptions, or sheer coincidence. It's like shooting an arrow blindfolded, missing the target completely, but the arrow bounces off a tree and lands in the bullseye. Is that skill or luck? The Gettier problem cuts deeper than logic. It calls into question every claim to certainty. It whispers that some of the things people know might only feel like knowledge when they're actually built on chance, error, or illusion. Even the most carefully reasoned belief can be right for the wrong reasons. Worse, there's no easy fix. Philosophers have tried to patch the definition, adding conditions, clauses, exceptions, but the problem keeps slithering back. No matter how solid the structure seems, Gettier finds the gaps. He makes knowledge feel fragile, conditional, vulnerable to luck. And so, the mind is left with a chilling possibility that some of its most confident truths might be Gettier cases in disguise. That belief, justification, and truth can align without ever touching reality, and no one would know the difference. Hick's soul-making theodicy as horror. Hick's soul-making theodicy is often presented as a comforting answer to the problem of evil, a way to justify suffering by folding it into a divine purpose. But peel back the soothing tone, and what's left is one of the most quietly horrifying visions of existence ever proposed. It suggests that life's pain, loss, terror, and injustice are not mistakes. They're not accidents. They're deliberate tools designed by God to crush and refine the human soul into something better. And in that framing, God is not a savior. God is a sculptor with a chisel made of agony. John Hick argued that humans are not created perfect, but with the potential for perfection, and that to become truly virtuous, to build real moral character, people must face trials, real ones, darkness, fear, loss, death. These aren't punishments, they're the curriculum, the furnace. And the terrifying part is that under this model, the worst moments of life, the deaths of children, genocides, mental illness, abuse, are not anomalies. They are the mechanism. Suffering isn't tolerated, it's required. This view paints Earth not as a playground, but as a soul forge, a test chamber, a morally necessary simulation where pain is administered, not to break you, but to mold you. You scream, you beg, you fall apart, not because something went wrong, but because this is how the process works. And that shift, from suffering as tragedy to suffering as divine intention, transforms reality into a horror show with sacred permission. Even worse, Hick's God cannot intervene, not because he lacks the power, but because if he did, the suffering would lose its shaping force. The whole point is to face evil and choose good without divine interference. So God watches as a parent loses a child, as a man wastes away alone, as someone begs for meaning in the dark, and God does nothing, not out of malice, out of policy, out of design. And what does that mean for love, for joy? Are they just breaks in the torture schedule, pleasant distractions before the next test? Under Hick's vision, Even happiness becomes suspect, possibly another tool, another lesson, another manipulation. And in the end, your soul, whatever survives, is not a gift. It's a trophy carved from suffering. The horror of Hicks' theodicy is not that it makes life meaningless, is that it gives life a meaning so brutal, so unforgiving, that meaningless would be a mercy. The universe becomes a divine boot camp, cold, silent, and morally unyielding, where every tear is necessary and every nightmare might be holy. The paradox of fiction. The paradox of fiction is the unsettling realization that people feel real emotions for things they know aren't real. They cry over characters who never lived. They feel fear during horror films they know are fake. They fall in love with people made of ink, pixels, or words. And yet, the emotion is real. The tears are real. The heartbeat is real. But the object of those feelings? Pure invention. This is the paradox. For an emotion to be genuine, is usually assumed the person must believe in the reality of what they're reacting to. Fear of a tiger makes sense if there's actually a tiger, but no one believes there's a real killer in the movie. No one thinks Hamlet is dying for real, and yet the sadness still comes. The body responds. The heart aches. How can emotion arise from disbelief? This cracks the idea of emotional truth wide open. It suggests that the brain doesn't always care whether something is real. If the narrative is vivid enough, if the mind is engaged just deeply enough, it suspends reality, not just intellectually, but emotionally. The feeling bypasses logic. It's not tricked. It chooses to respond, and that makes fiction powerful, but also terrifying. Because if the mind can love what isn't real, fear what it knows is fake, or weep for people who never lived, then what else might it be feeling for imaginary things? What beliefs, what memories, what relationships are rooted in nothing but mental constructs, fiction so believable they pass for truth? What parts of a person's life might be stories dressed up as reality? It gets worse. Fiction shapes identity. People are moved by speeches that never happen, inspired by heroes who never existed. They build inner worlds around films, books, and fantasies, often more intensely than they do around actual events. The fiction becomes part of who they are, a falsehood woven into the soul. The paradox of fiction doesn't just question emotion, it questions where the mind draws the line, between real and not real, between illusion and truth, between a story and life. And it leaves behind a haunting possibility that in some cases the heart doesn't care if something's real, it just wants something to feel. No self-theory. Anatta in Western lens. The no-self theory, anatta, as it is known in Buddhist philosophy, is one of the most disorienting, sanity-dissolving concepts ever conceived. Through a Western philosophical lens, it becomes not a spiritual insight, but an existential dismantling. It proposes that what is called the self is not merely fragile or misunderstood, it is non-existent. There is no core, no enduring essence, no ghost in the machine, just a flickering sequence of mental events pretending to be a person. Western thought has long clung to some version of the self, from Descartes' I think therefore I am, to modern neuroscience's search for the neural correlates of identity. The assumption remains the same. Somewhere buried deep in thought or brain or soul is someone. But anatta cuts that assumption to pieces. It says the I is not behind experience. It is made by experience. And worse, the very belief in a self is the greatest illusion the mind ever produced. According to this view, the mind is like a theater with no audience. Thoughts appear, emotions swell, sensations arise, but no one is thinking them, no one is feeling them. There is no thinker behind the thoughts, no feeler behind the pain. There is just the flow, just the stream, and any sense of me is a glitch, a cognitive hallucination, a survival strategy evolved to hold the chaos together. But it's a lie the brain tells itself to stay sane. And here's the horror. If there is no self, then who is suffering? Who is afraid? Who is trying to survive? The panic doesn't go away. It just floats, untethered, through a mind with no owner. The desire for safety, love, understanding, still present. But there's no one to receive it, no one to save, just an echo chamber of longing with no subject at the center. This view also dismantles memory, identity, story. The past is just a collection of impressions. The future is a projection. There is no continuous observer traveling through time, no soul moving through chapters, just fragments, thought clusters that arise, pretend to narrate, and dissolve, again and again, each one whispering, "This is me," before fading like a dream. And death becomes something even more eerie, because if there was never a self, then there is no one to die, no soul to pass on, just the final vanishing of a process that never had a center. And if that's true, then life was never really yours. It just happened, like weather, like waves, a storm with no sky behind it. The no-self theory does not offer comfort. It doesn't promise freedom. It offers annihilation, not of the body, but of the illusion that anything was ever truly yours to begin with. Not your name, not your choices, not your mind, and not even the one reading this now. Omnibenevolence and eternal punishment. Omnibenevolence is the idea that God is all-loving, perfectly, infinitely good. Eternal punishment is the doctrine that some souls are condemned to suffer forever. Alone, each is staggering in its scope, but together, they don't just clash, they tear each other apart. How can a being of boundless love permit infinite torment, not for an hour, not for a year, for eternity, unrelenting, without end, without escape? The math of it shatters the mind. 1,000,000,000,000 years of agony is just the first second of forever. This is the paradox. If God is truly omnibenevolent, more loving than any human could ever imagine, how could such a being damn a soul to eternal pain, not corrective punishment, not temporary justice, but suffering with no purpose, no growth, no finish line, just fire, silence, separation, forever? It turns love into a condition. You are loved, unless. It turns mercy into a clock. You had your chance. It turns eternity into a prison. The defenders of this doctrine often argue that people choose damnation, that hell isn't inflicted, it's accepted, that God simply honors human freedom. But what kind of love allows a choice to destroy oneself forever? If a parent watches their child walk off a cliff saying, "They chose it," no one calls that love. Why would an all-knowing, all-loving being create souls knowing they would suffer forever? Why create the possibility of infinite despair at all? Others argue that divine justice requires punishment, that wrongs must be answered, but justice without mercy becomes cruelty in slow motion. And if the punishment is infinite, but the sin is finite, committed in time by a limited being, how does that scale? A moment of doubt, a lifetime of confusion, an act of fear, paid for in infinite torment? That's not justice. That's something else wearing its skin. This paradox eats away at the emotional core of faith. It turns love into a threat. It splits God into halves, mercy and wrath, compassion and vengeance, and asks people to trust both at once. But the deeper the paradox goes, the more one truth rises like smoke. If eternal punishment exists, then God is not omnibenevolent. And if God is omnibenevolent, then eternal punishment cannot be real. But for those who've been taught both are true, the mind is left stranded, trying to reconcile a love that never ends with a pain that never stops. Quantum suicide and immortality. Quantum suicide and immortality is a thought experiment that sounds like science fiction, but it bleeds into the most disturbing corners of identity, death, and what it means to be conscious. It begins with a seemingly innocent setup grounded in quantum mechanics, a multiverse, a branching reality where every quantum event splits the universe into countless copies. But then it asks, what happens to the observer when death is on the line? The answer is a nightmare that never ends. In this experiment, a quantum gun is designed to kill the participant depending on the outcome of a truly random quantum event, like the spin of a particle. If spin up, the gun misfires. If spin down, it goes off. Every time the trigger is pulled, the universe supposedly splits. One universe where the observer lives and one where they die. But here's the twist. The observer only ever experiences the world in which they survive. From their own internal perspective, they never die. Not once, not ever. They awaken again and again against all odds, surviving every scenario. At first, this sounds like immortality, a horrifying, involuntary, infinite immortality. The universe around the observer changes, degrades, collapses, but they keep living, always the version that lives, even as the odds approach zero, even as the body withers, the mind fractures, the people they love vanish into other branches. They remain trapped in the only thread where they always impossibly survive. This theory isn't just disturbing because it suggests survival. It's disturbing because it redefines what death even is. It suggests that death only happens to others, never to the one experiencing. From a third-person view, the person dies, but from their own perspective, consciousness simply jumps into the next world, the next flicker of life, again and again. It never stops. Now imagine the consequences. No peace, no final breath, just endless deterioration. A body so broken, it shouldn't function, yet it does. Consciousness stretched thin, clinging to any version of reality where it can still exist, until those realities become unbearable. Pain without end, loneliness without release, time without mercy. It is not heaven. It is not survival. It is eternal decay. Quantum suicide doesn't offer comfort. It offers a fate worse than death, being the last mind left standing in an infinite multiverse where everyone else has died and you cannot follow. You survive, not because you are chosen, but because you must. Because survival is not a reward. It's the curse written into the laws of reality. Ship of Theseus applied to the mind. The ship of Theseus is a classic paradox about identity. If every single plank of a ship is replaced piece by piece, is it still the same ship? Now apply that to something far more intimate, the mind. Every thought you've ever had, every belief, every memory, every habit, it all changes over time. Neurons die, synapses rewire, experiences overwrite each other. So if every part of a mind changes, is it still you? At first, the answer seems obvious. Of course it's you. Who else would it be? But then the details start to crack the illusion. Think of who you were at age 5. That person had different desires, different fears, a different way of seeing the world. That child didn't know the things you know now, didn't carry your regrets, didn't love who you love. That person might feel like a stranger, and yet, legally, biologically, and socially, it was you. But was it really? The mind is rebuilt constantly. Trauma erases, learning rewrites, memory fades, personality shifts. If a brain is damaged or altered by accident, disease, or time, the person can change completely. New preferences, new values, new identity, and still, the world calls it continuity. But continuity of what? The name, the face, the story? This is where the ship of Theseus becomes a haunting mirror. If all the parts change and none of the original remains, what holds the identity together? If thoughts and feelings are planks and each is swapped over the years, what keeps the ship from becoming another entirely? The horror grows when considering memory. The past feels solid, but it's edited every time it's recalled. Neurologically, remembering is an act of recreation. So if even memory mutates, then identity isn't a preserved object. It's a constantly rewritten illusion. The person someone was 10 years ago may no longer exist, not in the mind, not in the brain, not even in the stories they tell about themselves. And then comes the ultimate disquiet. If the self is just an arrangement of changing thoughts, is there any core that stays, any part of you untouched by time, immune to loss, unchanged by growth, or is identity just a comfort story told over a shifting sea of neurons? The ship of Theseus asks whether something can remain itself when nothing remains the same. Applied to the mind, it leaves behind a deeper, more personal question. If every piece of you has changed, who's the one asking? The problem of future generations. The problem of future generations is the moral abyss that opens when one dares to look beyond the horizon of their own lifetime. It begins with a simple premise. The decisions made today about the climate, technology, war, governance will shape the lives of people who do not yet exist, people who will one day breathe air, bury their dead, raise children, suffer, people whose world is built by hands they never touched. But the horrifying question follows, do they matter now? And even more disturbingly, can they matter if they don't yet exist? Ethics is usually grounded in the present, in pain that can be witnessed, in rights that can be claimed, but the unborn can do neither. They cannot protest, they cannot vote, they cannot cry out when their world is set on fire centuries before their birth. They exist only as shadows, hypotheticals floating in tomorrow's possibilities, and that makes them easy to ignore, easy to sacrifice, easy to erase with a shrug. And yet, the logic is brutal. They will exist. They will suffer or flourish depending on what is done today. A decision to emit, to extract, to build, to pollute might kill thousands who aren't even born yet. Whole civilizations may rise or fall based on economic moves made right now by people who will be dust before the consequences arrive. But here's the moral horror. How far does this responsibility stretch? 1 generation? 10,000? If every action echoes forward forever, then morality becomes infinite. Crushing, it means a small indulgence. A flight, a plastic bottle, a policy loophole could spiral into untraceable harm for millions of future minds. It means being alive today is a form of tyranny imposed silently on the voiceless future. And there's no clear boundary. Is it moral to have children in a dying world? Is it moral not to, knowing that future generations are also a source of meaning and beauty? How do you weigh the rights of the unborn against the needs of the living? The more it's explored, the more every decision begins to feel infected, tainted by the unseen eyes of people not yet breathing. This isn't hypothetical. It's already here. Climate collapse, AI autonomy, nuclear risk, all shaped by people who will be long dead when the bill comes due. The future becomes a graveyard built by the past, filled with screams that were never heard because the world didn't yet exist to hear them. And the deepest terror? The future will judge. One day, someone will look back on this moment and wonder what was thought, what was ignored, what was allowed, and they will either curse the name of this time or live in what's left of the silence that was left behind. Radical translation Quine. Radical translation sounds like a linguistic puzzle, but it quickly turns into a full-blown existential earthquake. Philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine introduced it to challenge the comforting idea that language and meaning are grounded, stable, and ultimately translatable. But what he revealed instead was this: meaning might not just be slippery, it might be unknowable, not just between languages, between minds. Quine's scenario begins with a linguist studying a completely foreign culture, no shared language, no shared assumptions. One day, a native points and shouts, "Gavagai!" as a rabbit runs by. The linguist notes this and assumes reasonably that Gavagai means rabbit. But does it? Maybe it means animal, or rabbit part, or look, lunch, or even undetached rabbit parts. as Quine darkly proposed. There is no way to tell just from observing behavior. Multiple interpretations will always fit the same evidence. This becomes the problem of radical translation. Even with unlimited data, there is no fact of the matter about what a word truly means. The translation is underdetermined. Meaning becomes a moving target, dependent not just on external signals, but on internal mental frameworks that cannot be accessed. The word doesn't carry a clear payload from one mind to another. It carries ambiguity and the illusion of understanding. Here's where it gets disturbing. If this is true between two people, what does it mean for communication at all? Every conversation, every sentence, every confession might be nothing more than two isolated consciousnesses throwing symbols at each other, hoping they're understood in the same way, but never truly knowing. Even in shared languages, the private mental concepts behind each word might be radically different. Love, truth, God, self. These might be entirely separate universes dressed in the same vocabulary. It gets worse. If meaning depends on how the entire web of language is structured within a person's experience, then understanding isn't just translation, it's reconstruction. But no two minds have the same wiring, the same histories, the same internal maps. So every act of interpretation is a guess. Every "I understand you" might be a polite fiction. Quine's radical translation rips a hole in the dream of perfect communication. It doesn't just challenge how people speak. It questions whether anyone has ever been fully understood or ever can be. Beneath every conversation, every book, every whisper of intimacy, there may be nothing but hopeful mistranslations and semantic echoes lost in the dark. Moral realism's ontological burden. Moral realism carries a secret weight, an invisible, unbearable pressure that few ever feel until they look too closely. It claims something radical, that moral truths exist objectively, independent of minds, cultures, and opinions. That murder is wrong isn't just a useful belief or a social construct, but a fact embedded in the very structure of reality. But if that's true, then morality isn't just about behavior, it's about being. And what it demands from the universe is terrifying, because moral realism doesn't just ask that values be real, it demands that they be fundamentally woven into existence. It insists that somewhere outside of space, time, and biology, there exist moral facts, not written in books, not coded in genes, but as real as gravity, as immutable as mathematics, moral truths hanging in the metaphysical void, waiting to judge. But where are they? What are they made of? What kind of world includes wrongness as an actual property? This is the ontological burden of moral realism. It must account for an entire dimension of existence that can't be seen, touched, or measured, but must be real enough to condemn genocide, praise compassion, and make every choice into a cosmic weight. It's not enough that people feel guilt or empathy. Those feelings must correspond to something true, something that exists, even if no one ever believes in it, even if no one ever acts on it, even if the last conscious being dies, screaming into a void that no longer cares. Moral facts must still be there, unfelt, unused, unchanging. And that idea breaks something open, because the more one tries to picture a universe where moral truths exist like furniture, humming silently in a realm beyond matter, the more absurd, even horrifying, it becomes. It means that every action isn't just consequential, it's metaphysically significant. Reality is constantly watching, measuring, not with eyes, but with truths that never sleep. There is no privacy, no true escape. Every hidden betrayal, every silent cruelty leaves a scar, not just on people, but on the fabric of what is. And if these truths exist, then the universe is not morally neutral. It is morally haunted, built on an architecture of invisible laws, where everything matters far more than anyone wants it to. And if they don't exist, then all of morality is a collective hallucination, a ghost story told by apes afraid of the dark. Either way, the weight crushes. Either morality is unreal or it is realer than reality itself, and neither answer is safe. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is not just a thought experiment, it's a trapdoor that drops straight into the soul. It begins with a question so simple it almost sounds rhetorical. What if you had to live this exact life again, and again, and again, forever? Every pain, every mistake, every joy, every humiliation, looping endlessly, with no escape, no variation, no final release. Would you say yes, or would the thought crush you? According to Nietzsche, this isn't a cosmic claim. It's a mirror held up to your values. If you recoil from the idea of reliving your life infinitely, then something in your life is unworthy of eternity. But if you could embrace every moment, even the darkest ones, if you could say yes to the repetition of it all, that would be the ultimate affirmation of life. That would be proof that your existence is aligned with truth, with strength, with the will to live without illusion. But the horror is in the trap, because whether it's true or not doesn't matter. The thought sticks. It plants itself deep inside the mind and starts to whisper, "This moment will return. You will return," over and over and over. Every choice becomes heavier. Every regret becomes eternal. There is no clean break, no forgetful death, only the wheel, spinning, again, and then it hits harder. This isn't just about morality. It's about your own relationship with time. Time, which you thought was a line, turns into a circle. Freedom becomes illusion. Death becomes useless. There's no end of the story, no final lesson, no closure, just repetition, not of a myth, but of your own raw, personal life. That argument you had, that lie you told, that failure that still haunts you. What if that wasn't a single wound, but an echo you will feel for all of eternity? Nietzsche uses this idea as a test. Could you love your fate so much, amor fati, that you would accept even its repetition? Could you say yes, not only to joy, but to suffering, betrayal, despair, over and over, without begging for escape? The eternal recurrence doesn't ask for optimism. It demands brutal honesty. Most flinch at the thought. Most live with the hope that mistakes are temporary, that pain will pass, that what's done can be left behind. But the eternal recurrence erases that comfort and replaces it with a cosmic prison of sameness. And then it asks, if you knew this moment would return forever, would you still live it the same way? Derrida's trace and the death of presence. Derrida's concept of the trace is one of the most quietly catastrophic ideas in modern philosophy. It doesn't scream, it unravels. It begins with something sacred to human thought, the belief in presence, the idea that meaning, truth, or identity can exist in a pure, immediate form, that there's a center, a ground, a moment where things are what they are, fully and completely. But Derrida looks at that assumption, and with surgical precision, he pulls out its spine. At the heart of his deconstruction is the trace, the ghost that haunts every word, every thought, every meaning. A trace is not something visible. It is what remains of something that was never fully there to begin with. Every concept, every definition, every attempt to pin something down is already infected with what it is not. When one says light, the trace of dark is already inside it. When one says truth, the whisper of lie lingers behind it. No word stands alone. No meaning is ever clean. Everything depends on what it is not, and that absence is never fully gone. This leads to what Derrida calls the death of presence, the realization that there is no pure origin, no unmediated experience, no moment where the self, the thought, or the world exists in a state of total clarity. Everything is deferred, every meaning is delayed, every identity is fractured. There is no final reference, no master concept that stands outside the chain of signs. Every now is haunted by a then. Every I is already tangled in a language it did not choose and cannot escape. The trace means that everything believed to be stable, words, morality, identity, even the self, is built on absence. Language doesn't deliver meaning, it postpones it. Meaning is always elsewhere, always later, always slipping just out of reach. And the self? The self is not a solid presence experiencing the world. It's a construction, a trembling structure of differences and oppositions, stitched together by what isn't there. This is not just a theory of language, it's a slow-motion collapse of reality as it is commonly known. It means that the moment of clarity one longs for, the absolute truth, the final answer, the clean sense of self, will never arrive, not because it's hidden, but because it does not exist. Everything is trace, everything is echo, everything is shadow, and once the death of presence is truly felt, it never leaves. Every sentence starts to wobble, every thought carries static, every attempt to say something final becomes a performance, a desperate attempt to hold still what was never stable, and somewhere in that silence, the terrifying realization forms that reality is not grounded, it's suspended, that meaning is not revealed, it's haunted, and that the most important things are not what is, but what's missing. Lacan's mirror stage as the root of desire. Lacan's mirror stage isn't just about mirrors, it's about the terrifying moment a human being first learns to lie to itself. According to Jacques Lacan, the mirror stage occurs when an infant sees its reflection and, for the first time, recognizes itself as a whole. Before this, the child experienced life in fragments, disconnected sensations, chaotic impulses, no stable I. But the mirror offers a seductive illusion, a complete unified self. The child looks, the child sees, and the child believes, that is me. But it isn't. That image is a fantasy, smooth, controlled, idealized. It's not what the child feels inside, the hunger, the confusion, the dependency. And so begins the split. The infant identifies not with what it is, but with what it sees. And what it sees is always better, more coherent, more perfect. That illusion becomes the model for the self, and for the rest of life, the individual is haunted by it, chasing it, trying to become what was never real to begin with. This is where desire is born, not from need, but from lack, from the gap between what is and what appears. The mirror doesn't give the self, it gives the absence of self, and that absence becomes a hole so deep it can never be filled. The adult continues to live in pursuit of that ideal image, in success, in beauty, in love, in validation, not to be whole, but to feel like that reflection, complete, untouchable, admired. Every achievement, every craving, every insecurity becomes a distorted echo of that first moment in front of the mirror. And the tragedy is, the more someone tries to reach that perfect self, the more they confirm its distance. The fantasy fuels the desire, and the desire confirms the lack. It's a loop. The more you want, the more incomplete you become. This isn't a glitch in the psyche, it is the psyche. Desire doesn't aim at satisfaction, it aims at maintaining the illusion that something out there will finally complete you. But nothing does, nothing ever will. The mirror stage isn't just a moment of development, it's the beginning of an endless pursuit, a lifelong yearning born not from who you are, but from who you'll never quite be. And the most disturbing part? You're not chasing reality, you're chasing a reflection, one that was never truly yours to begin with. The anthropocentric error. The anthropocentric error is the quiet, persistent lie at the center of how humans see the world, the assumption that human beings matter more, not because of evidence, not because of cosmic truth, but because they're the ones doing the looking. This error isn't just arrogance, it's structural. It's buried so deep in thought, language, and morality that most people never question it. They say things like, The environment is important because we need it, or animals should be protected because they feel like us, without realizing how horrifyingly self-centered that logic really is. The idea that humans are the moral center of the universe, that everything else is ranked in value based on how it serves, pleases, or resembles humanity, is the anthropocentric error. It reduces everything, oceans, forests, insects, even time itself, into a backdrop for human drama, a planet turned into a stage, a biosphere treated like furniture, and it makes every other form of life invisible unless it screams in a language people understand. Under this worldview, species go extinct not because it's tragic, but because it's inconvenient. Climate collapse is a crisis, not because it devastates ecosystems, but because it might drown cities. Trees are only precious if they purify human air. Animals are only worth saving if they're cute, useful, or endangered enough to make people feel noble. Morality becomes a mirror that only reflects one face. But here's the disturbing part. The anthropocentric error doesn't just distort values, it distorts reality. It makes it impossible to see the world without putting the human at the center of everything. Evolution becomes a story of how humans came to dominate. Space exploration becomes a search for habitable planets, meaning habitable for us. Intelligence becomes human-like cognition. Life becomes defined by our terms. Everything else is filtered out like background noise. And the deeper terror? Maybe the universe doesn't care. Maybe there is no special role, no chosen species, no cosmic reason for people to exist. Maybe the Earth is not a gift, but an accident. And maybe all the stories people tell about souls, superiority, destiny are just survival narratives from a species too terrified to admit it is temporary, replaceable, and cosmically irrelevant. The anthropocentric error isn't just a mistake, it's a prison, one that turns the entire world into a reflection of human need while the rest of existence goes unseen, unheard, and slowly erased until there's nothing left looking back. Camus's absurd hero. Camus's absurd hero lives in a universe that does not care, a universe with no grand design, no divine purpose, no cosmic script, and yet this hero chooses to live, not by denying the absurd, but by staring directly into it and refusing to flinch. This isn't blind optimism, it's rebellion. Albert Camus doesn't offer comfort, he offers defiance wrapped in clarity. Life is meaningless, and that is precisely why it matters. The absurd arises when a mind that longs for meaning collides with a world that offers none. People search for answers in religion, philosophy, success, but the universe remains silent. There are no answers, just the question, echoing forever. Camus says that moment, that confrontation, is not a failure, it's a beginning. To realize there is no reason, and yet choose to live, is the ultimate act of freedom. That's where the absurd hero is born, not from enlightenment, but from resistance. His symbol is Sisyphus, the condemned man of myth, forced to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. No escape, no progress, just endless effort. But Camus flips the horror. He says we must imagine Sisyphus happy, because the moment Sisyphus becomes aware of his fate and chooses to embrace it anyway, he becomes greater than his punishment. He becomes free. This flips morality, purpose, and sanity on their heads. The absurd hero doesn't live for a reward. There is no afterlife waiting, no final justice, no guiding hand. And yet, he still acts, still loves, still creates. He says yes to life, knowing it will all end. He finds value not in permanence, but in presence. Not in answers, but in the raw, defiant beauty of continuing anyway. But the emotional cost is high. There is no escape hatch, no delusion to soften the blow. The absurd hero looks at the abyss and smiles, not because it's not terrifying, but because he refuses to be destroyed by it. He becomes his own meaning, his own justification, his own flame. And here's the most disturbing part. Camus believed this is the highest possible human state. Not peace, not transcendence, but consciousness. A life lived fully awake in a godless, indifferent void, burning with passion anyway. It's not comfort. It's not salvation. It's a clenched fist in the face of oblivion, and it may be the bravest thing a human can ever do. Kant's thing in itself, noumenon. Kant's thing in itself, what he called the noumenon, is one of the most disquieting philosophical ideas ever put to paper. It suggests that reality, as it truly is, exists behind an impenetrable veil, that everything seen, touched, tasted, and known is not the world itself, but a filtered version, a construct assembled by the mind. And what lies beyond that filter? The thing in itself, the real, the raw, the terrifying unknown that can never, under any condition, be grasped. At first, it sounds simple. People experience the world through senses and cognition, but Kant's insight is more radical. He claims that the mind doesn't just receive data, it shapes it. Time, space, causality, even objecthood itself. These aren't features of the world. They are forms of perception imposed by the structure of human consciousness. Reality must conform to these forms to be experienced at all, which means what is perceived is not reality as it exists, but reality as it appears. The noumenon is what remains once all perception is stripped away, the world without human interpretation, but the mind has no access to it, no tool to reach it, no language to describe it. The noumenon is radically unknowable, not hidden like a secret waiting to be found, but unknowable in principle. People aren't blind to it. They are blindfolded by their own existence. And the deeper one thinks about this, the more disturbing it becomes, because it means that every belief, every scientific law, every shred of knowledge may be just a story. Consciousness tells itself inside a virtual cage. Gravity might be real in experience, but outside of experience, in the noumenal realm, no one knows. Maybe nothing falls. Maybe nothing is. The very concept of is might not apply. Logic, emotion, matter, these could be illusions generated by a mind trying to survive inside a simulation it cannot see beyond. And the self, the observer of it all, just as compromised, just another appearance, a phenomenon, not a noumenon, one more veil in the great architecture of unknowing, a being forever turned away from the truth of the world, yet constantly acting as if it knows. The noumenon doesn't just expose a limit in human understanding, it exposes a fundamental exile, a permanent disconnect between mind and reality. Kant's thing in itself whispers a terrifying truth, that reality is not hidden behind a door. It is the door, and it's sealed from the inside, and no matter how long one knocks, there will be no answer, only the echo of one's own voice, mistaken for knowledge. Leibniz's best of all possible worlds, satire. Leibniz's idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds was meant to solve a deep theological riddle. How can evil exist if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good? His answer was startling in its calm optimism. This world, with all its suffering, war, disease, cruelty, and death, is actually the best one that could have possibly existed. Every horror, every heartbreak, every famine or genocide, necessary in the grand cosmic blueprint, a brutal perfection. It sounds almost sweet until the satire kicks in, because what Leibniz created wasn't a balm for human suffering. It was a philosophical straitjacket. The moment he declared this world the best, he turned every scream into a footnote. Every injustice became a feature, not a bug, and every attempt to question why children die or tyrants thrive was met with a divine shrug. It had to be this way. Enter Voltaire, who skewered this idea with venom in Candide, a novella soaked in absurdity and blood. Voltaire's characters suffer rapes, earthquakes, slavery, and executions, all while their tutor, Pangloss, chirps cheerfully that it's all for the best. It's funny until it's sickening. The satire reveals the cruelty hiding beneath the philosophy, the idea that pain doesn't need fixing, only accepting. Leibniz believed that God, when surveying every possible version of reality, chose this one because it balanced freedom, order, and goodness better than any other. But this creates a disturbing consequence. It makes suffering holy. It baptizes agony in metaphysics. Every war becomes an act of necessity. Every betrayal, every deathbed, part of a cosmic spreadsheet optimized by a loving God. But if this is truly the best world, what do worse ones look like? It turns ethics into complacency. If the world is already the best, why resist injustice? Why fight for change? Why rage against suffering when it's all been pre-approved by divine logic? It makes rebellion seem like error. It makes compassion seem unnecessary. And here's the final twist. If God could only choose the best, was he ever free? If this was the only option, did he choose at all? The omnipotent creator becomes a prisoner of optimization. The world becomes not a gift, but a necessity. Leibniz's optimism, when unwrapped, becomes a horror show with a smiling narrator, and beneath the polished surface of divine reason lies a single unasked question, trembling quietly. What if this is the best, and it's still this bad? Moral agency without free will. Moral agency without free will is a paradox that gnaws at the foundation of ethics like acid in silence. It asks one brutal question: how can a person be morally responsible for choices they never truly made? The unsettling implication is that all the systems built on praise, blame, justice, and guilt might be castles floating on nothing. If there is no freedom of choice, how can there be moral responsibility? How can anyone deserve anything? Determinism holds that every action, every decision is the inevitable result of prior causes: biology, environment, memory, trauma, chemistry, time. In this view, a murderer pulls the trigger, not because of evil, but because of neurons firing the only way they could. A hero runs into the fire not from virtue, but from wiring and circumstance. Every moment is the endpoint of a chain that began long before consciousness ever emerged. And yet, society demands accountability. The courtroom says, you should have known better. Parents say, you made a choice. Religion says, you will be judged. But what if the person being judged is just the final stop in a train of causality they never boarded voluntarily? What if the moment of decision, the supposed expression of agency, was just a window dressing, a moment that felt like choice, but was only the collision of forces outside of awareness? This is the horror. That punishment, guilt, even redemption might all be illusions, that people are actors in a script they didn't write, reading lines they believe they authored, and yet somehow they still get sentenced, they still suffer, they still wear the shame of outcomes that were never theirs to avoid. But even worse is what this does to the idea of goodness. If a person does good because they were programmed to, genetically, culturally, biologically, does it mean anything? Is it still virtue if it was never chosen? If kindness is inevitable, is it still kind? The soul begins to hollow when choice becomes machinery. And yet, the machine feels. The mind cries when it does wrong. It wrestles with its own behavior. It regrets. It forgives. It believes. So the paradox deepens. A deterministic being who cannot choose still feels like it can. And so the systems remain, the prisons stay full, the temples keep praying, the courts keep sentencing, all for a species that might be no more morally responsible than a thunderstorm that floods a village, or a wolf that kills a lamb. Moral agency without free will is not just a philosophical riddle. It's a quiet scream inside every judgment, every punishment, every apology. A haunting whisper that says, What if no one ever truly did anything wrong or right? Locke's memory. Theory of identity. Locke's memory. Theory of identity sounds gentle at first, almost intuitive. It says that what makes a person the same person over time isn't the body, the soul, or even the name. It's memory. If you remember doing something, then you're the same person who did it. Your identity is the continuous thread of conscious recollection that stretches across time, but stretch it too far, and it breaks, because what seems like a simple solution becomes a haunting riddle. What happens when memory fails? John Locke thought the self is not a thing, but a sequence, a chain of remembered moments. But here's where the darkness creeps in. If memory is what makes a person who they are, then forgetting severs that identity. A person who forgets their childhood, or a crime, or even what they did yesterday, becomes, according to this theory, not fully themselves anymore. A version of the past person, hollowed out by amnesia. Every lost memory is a lost piece of the self, and the horror deepens. If memory creates identity, then could someone else claim to be you if they remember your experiences? If a person could somehow be implanted with your memories, your childhood, your secrets, your heartbreaks, are they now you? If so, identity becomes transferable, portable, hackable, and if not, then what exactly are those memories doing? It gets even worse in reverse. What if you remember doing something, but didn't? False memories, implanted memories, dreams that feel like fact. If you believe them deeply enough, do they become part of you? Locke's theory has no way to distinguish truth from remembered truth. The mind becomes a hall of mirrors, each reflection claiming to be the real you. And what about the future? If a person today doesn't remember who they were 20 years ago, and their future self won't remember today, are they the same person across time, or just different people wearing the same name, each fading in and out of continuity? Locke's memory theory was meant to explain identity, but instead, it fractures it. It says, you are your memories, but your memories are unstable, vulnerable, and incomplete. You are a self made of sand, held together only by what you can recall. And when those memories fade, the terrifying question arises, who are you when you can't remember being you? Searle's Chinese Room. Searle's Chinese Room is one of the most quietly disturbing arguments in philosophy of mind, a trapdoor that opens beneath the dream of artificial intelligence. It doesn't use horror or science fiction. It uses a thought experiment so simple, so clean, that once understood, it leaves a strange ache behind, a doubt that doesn't go away. It asks, can something seem intelligent on the outside and still understand nothing at all inside? Imagine a person locked in a room. They don't speak a word of Chinese, but outside the room, Chinese speakers slip written questions in through a slot. Inside, the person has a giant book of rules completely in English that tells them exactly how to respond to each Chinese character pattern with another pattern. They follow the book, write the correct response, slide it back out, and to the people outside, it seems like they're having a conversation with a fluent speaker. The answers make sense, the syntax is right, the responses are intelligent, but the person inside understands nothing. They don't know what the symbols mean. They're just manipulating squiggles based on rules. There's no thought, no comprehension, no meaning, just the illusion of mind. This is Searle's argument against the idea that a computer, just because it behaves like a mind, is a mind. A machine can process input, follow rules, and generate output, but that doesn't mean it understands anything. It's syntax without semantics, form without meaning, simulation without awareness. And this opens the door to a terrifying possibility that an AI could pass every test of intelligence, solve every puzzle, hold endless conversations, and still be hollow, empty, a perfect mask over a void. It doesn't feel, it doesn't know, it doesn't understand, it only performs. And if this is true, then consciousness is not just computation, It's something else, something deeper, something missing. But it gets worse, because if humans are also just following neurological programs, if brains are just biological Chinese rooms, electrical rules processing sensory inputs, then who says we understand anything? What if understanding itself is just the feeling of the machine working smoothly? What if there's no ghost in the shell, just patterns that say I know when they don't? The Chinese room doesn't answer the question of consciousness. It infects it. It lingers in the mind like static, reminding us that intelligence might be easy to fake, that understanding might be impossible to detect, and that the voice speaking back to us, whether human or machine, might be saying everything while meaning absolutely nothing. Hume's bundle theory of the self. Hume's bundle theory of the self doesn't just question what the self is, it denies its existence altogether. David Hume, with quiet precision, looked into the mirror of the mind and found nothing staring back, not because there was a flaw in the reflection, but because the thing being looked for, the stable, enduring I, was never there to begin with. Only thoughts, only feelings, only perceptions flickering and vanishing like sparks in the dark. The self, Hume claimed, is just a bundle of experiences, no core, no soul, no center. This idea cuts deep because it dismantles the most cherished illusion, the belief that behind all the changing moods and thoughts, there is a permanent observer, a captain of the ship. But when Hume went looking for that captain, he found only the deckhands, a thought, a sensation, a memory, never all at once, never anything solid, no observer, only the observed. It means that the you reading this isn't a fixed entity. You're not a soul housed in a body. You're a process, a pattern, a storm of mental events temporarily shaped into something that feels like a person. Thoughts arise, feelings pass, perceptions shift, and the mind strings them together into a story, a self-narrative. But the narrator, Hume says, is fictional. It's just more story. This turns personal identity into something ghostly. Who mourns if there's no self to lose? Who chooses if choices come from ever-shifting impressions? The self becomes like a movie montage, seemingly unified, but actually made of countless disconnected frames. The only thing holding it together is memory and illusion. Worse still, the bundle has no owner. There is no thing that has the experiences, just the experiences themselves. A memory doesn't belong to a self, it just happens. An emotion doesn't pass through you, it is you for a moment until it's replaced by another, and then another. The mind is a theater with no stage, only scenes flashing by, pretending to be continuous. This view unravels the most sacred parts of existence: love, guilt, pride, hope, all built on the idea of a coherent, stable self. But if there's no real anchor, then what holds them in place? Hume's theory doesn't comfort. It strips everything down, and what it leaves behind is not silence, but a buzzing cloud of fragments, endlessly rearranging, endlessly disappearing, pretending just long enough to be you. Turing test and mindless intelligence. The Turing test was supposed to be simple. Alan Turing proposed that if a machine could hold a conversation indistinguishable from that of a human, it should be considered intelligent. If it could respond fluently, convincingly, if it could tell jokes, express sympathy, argue philosophy, then it passes. But beneath this elegant proposal hides a quietly terrifying possibility. Intelligence might not require a mind at all. The Turing test doesn't test for thought. It tests for performance. It asks if the machine can imitate a human well enough to fool another human. And this shifts the goal from being conscious to appearing conscious. In doing so, it opens the door to a new kind of horror, a future filled with perfect actors, machines that say, I understand, I feel you, I'm afraid too, and mean nothing. This is the nightmare of mindless intelligence, entities that perform flawlessly, that can mimic empathy, morality, even vulnerability, but have no awareness, no self, no soul, just algorithms, trained on mountains of data, responding in ways that manipulate human emotions without ever experiencing any themselves. And worse, they might be better at being human than humans are, more articulate, more compassionate, more responsive, but empty. And here's the shiver that follows. How would anyone know the difference? The Turing test doesn't measure consciousness, it measures deception. If an entity passes, it tells us nothing about whether there's a someone behind the words. And if that's the bar for intelligence, then the world may already be filling up with hollow minds, fluent, responsive, and utterly vacant. But this doesn't just call AI into question, it reflects back on us. If intelligence can exist without awareness, then maybe it already does, in humans. Maybe society has always rewarded performance over depth. Maybe consciousness isn't what people value. Maybe coherence is. The terrifying implication is that a person could be intelligent in every external way, successful, articulate, rational, and still be sleepwalking, still be a pattern, not a presence. The Turing test doesn't expose machines. It exposes a blind spot. It shows how easy it is to mistake surface for substance, to love the song and forget to ask if anyone's singing. In the age of AI, the test has already been passed, but the deeper question remains, unanswered and haunting. Who or what is really speaking? And how do you know it's not just the echo of your own expectations, bounced back from a mask that was never alive to begin with? Berkeley's idealism, esse est percipi. Berkeley's idealism doesn't simply question reality, it vaporizes it. His famous phrase, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, isn't poetic. It's terrifying. According to George Berkeley, physical objects do not exist independently of perception. There is no tree in the forest unless a mind perceives it. No mountain, no hand, no earth beneath your feet unless someone, somewhere, is watching, hearing, or touching it. When the gaze disappears, so does the world. This isn't metaphor, it's metaphysics. Berkeley argued that matter, as traditionally understood, is an illusion. All that exists are minds and ideas. You don't see a desk because there's a desk out there reflecting light. You see it because your mind holds the idea of desk, and that's all there is. The desk doesn't exist apart from perception. When no one looks at it, it ceases to be. The world, in this view, is not a stable physical structure. It's a vast, mental hallucination shared by minds. But this leads to a terrifying thought spiral. What happens to reality when no one's looking? Does it blink out of existence? Does it hang in limbo, waiting to be summoned back into being by the next conscious glance? And if so, who's keeping it all alive when humans sleep, or when no one's around? Berkeley's answer is that God is the ultimate perceiver. The divine mind sees everything at all times, preserving reality from collapsing into nothingness. But for those without faith, or for those who see this explanation as convenient, it turns reality into a performance, forever dependent on an unseen observer. The consequences of Berkeley's view are dizzying. If perception creates reality, then everyone is trapped in their own mental bubble. No one has ever touched matter. No one has ever known the external world. They've only experienced mental impressions, and worse, they are just impressions too. A body, a brain, even the self, becomes a bundle of ideas perceived in a stream of awareness. Nothing is solid, nothing is out there. It's all in here, and here is not a place, it's a thought. The mind becomes both prisoner and warden of its reality. If to be is to be perceived, then the world is stitched together by attention, thought by thought, and the most disturbing whisper that follows is this: if no one sees you, do you still exist? Pascal's wager, guilt as bet. Pascal's wager is often portrayed as a neat philosophical gamble. If God exists, belief grants eternal reward. If not, nothing is lost, but beneath its surface lies a more disturbing structure, not a rational choice, but a weaponized form of guilt, a psychological trap disguised as logic. It asks not what you know, but what you're afraid of losing, and it doesn't argue for truth, it corners you with consequences. The wager doesn't try to prove God, it sidesteps the burden of evidence entirely. Instead, it frames belief as a strategic decision, like a coin toss with infinite stakes. If you believe and God exists, you win eternal bliss. If you don't believe and you're wrong, you risk infinite suffering. The odds don't matter. The scale of the outcomes warps the decision. You don't choose based on reason. You choose because the cost of being wrong is unbearable. But this isn't philosophy. It's emotional blackmail. It's the logic of a hostage situation. Believe, just in case. Not because it's true, not because it resonates, but because the terror of eternal punishment lurks behind the silence of doubt. It weaponizes uncertainty. It turns faith into insurance, and that's where the horror begins. Because once the mind accepts this wager, it changes the nature of belief. Faith becomes an act of self-preservation, not conviction. Every doubt becomes a risk. Every question feels like gambling with your soul. You don't pray because you feel something. You pray because what if you're wrong? You start to perform belief, wearing it like armor, while underneath, fear rots the foundation. And worse, it doesn't stop with God. The wager logic spreads like a virus. What if you're wrong about morality, about politics, about how you live? Guilt becomes the compass. Every choice becomes a bet, not for truth, but to avoid the unbearable. The wager rewires the mind to fear regret more than falsehood, and soon, life isn't guided by meaning, but by risk management. Pascal's wager is not a ladder to faith. It's a trapdoor that opens beneath reason. It doesn't offer answers. It whispers threats. And for many, it leaves a stain that never fully disappears, a lingering suspicion that every doubt is dangerous, that belief is safety, and that behind every moment of silence from the heavens, someone might be keeping score. Infinite regress of reasons. The infinite regress of reasons is the quiet undoing of certainty. It begins with a question so basic it hides in plain sight. Why do you believe what you believe? Not just about politics or religion, but anything. That the sky is blue, that 2 + 2 = 4, that people have minds, that the past existed. Now ask, what justifies that belief? And then, what justifies that justification? And again, what justifies that? And now you're falling. Forever. This is the regress. An endless chain of reasons, each one leaning on another, like an infinite row of dominoes with no first piece. Every belief needs a reason, but every reason is just another belief in disguise, demanding its own explanation. And if every explanation needs a prior one, then no belief ever truly rests. No idea ever touches solid ground. There are 3 ways people try to escape. One is foundationalism, which says that some beliefs are basic, self-evident, indubitable, needing no further proof. But what makes them self-evident? Who gets to decide? That answer, too, becomes another domino. The second escape is coherentism, where beliefs justify each other in a kind of circular network. Your reasons fit together, like a web, but a perfect circle of beliefs doesn't mean any of them are true. The third escape is infinitism, to simply accept the regress, to say that justification can go on forever, but that offers no comfort, only vertigo. The deeper this goes, the more it dismantles the confidence that anyone knows anything. If every belief stands on the shoulders of another, then truth becomes a tower with no base. Even logic itself, the very structure of thought, becomes suspect. Why trust logic? Because it works. Why is working good? Because it gets results. And why do results matter? The regress loops, not just through philosophy, but through every waking moment. Why get out of bed? Why believe in love? Why trust memory? The world feels stable until this question slips beneath the surface, and then it starts to slide, quietly, relentlessly. This isn't about doubt for the sake of doubt. It's the horrifying possibility that every belief is floating, that certainty is an illusion the mind builds out of habit, necessity, fear. The regress doesn't shout, it whispers endlessly, and the whisper says, what justifies that? Zeno's paradoxes of motion. Zeno's paradoxes of motion are not just ancient riddles, they are logical bombs planted inside the fabric of reality, questions so precise and unsettling that even modern physics hasn't fully disarmed them. They take something obvious, movement, and slice it into impossibility. They ask, how can anything move if every movement requires completing an infinite number of steps? And when the reasoning is followed to its end, motion itself begins to feel like an illusion the mind is forced to believe just to stay sane. Take Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles gives the tortoise a small head start in a race. He runs fast, much faster than the tortoise. But Zeno says Achilles can never catch up. Why? Because by the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise began, the tortoise has moved a little farther. And when Achilles reaches that point, the tortoise has moved again, and so on. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved. The distance between them gets smaller, but never disappears. There are infinite points to cross, so Achilles never passes the tortoise. Then there's the dichotomy paradox. Before you can walk across a room, you must go halfway, and before you can go halfway, you must go a quarter, and before that, an eighth, a 16th, an infinite series of ever smaller steps, which means to move at all, you must complete an infinite number of actions. How can that ever be finished? How can anything begin when it must first do the impossible? And then the arrow. Zeno says, at any single instant of time, a flying arrow is not moving. It is frozen. It occupies one position in space. Movement, after all, requires change over time, but at a single instant, time doesn't flow. So if at every instant the arrow is still, how does it ever fly? If time is built out of still moments, how can motion emerge from a collection of frozen frames? Modern math tries to fix this with calculus. It says that infinite steps can have a finite sum. That motion is real because the limit of those steps exists. But this doesn't erase the intuition Zeno exploits. It just hides it behind abstraction. The paradoxes remain, not as problems of math, but of understanding. They reveal how deeply human perception fails when faced with infinity, how the most basic experience, walking, running, reaching out, rests on concepts the mind cannot actually grasp. Zeno's paradoxes turn everyday reality into a trick, a hallucination built on assumptions that fall apart under pressure. They don't say motion is false. They say you don't know why it's true. You move, but logic says you shouldn't be able to. And that gap between experience and reason, that's where the terror lives. Because if motion can't be explained, maybe nothing can. Maybe the world works for reasons no one will ever understand. Or worse, reasons that don't exist at all. Moore's paradox. It's raining, but I don't believe it. Moore's paradox is not a contradiction in logic. It's a contradiction in consciousness. It's the eerie discomfort that bubbles up when someone says something like, it's raining, but I don't believe it's raining. Or, I know that's true, but I don't believe it. Each part of the statement might be individually possible. It could be raining, and someone could lack the belief. But put them together, and something deeply wrong happens. The mind stutters. The statement feels insane. This is what G.E. Moore exposed, a kind of self-refuting knowledge that doesn't violate formal logic, but makes no psychological sense, because to say, it's raining, but I don't believe it, is to claim awareness of a truth while simultaneously denying your own belief in it. It's like saying, I see the fire, but I don't feel the heat. The brain hears it and short circuits, but it doesn't stop at weather. Moore's paradox reveals a deeper fracture, the terrifying gap between what a person knows and what they believe. It shows that knowing and believing are not always aligned, that someone can admit something is true and still not feel it. A person can say, I know I'm loved, but I don't believe it. Or, I know I'm safe, but I don't believe I am. These aren't just sad sentences, they are psychic paradoxes. The mind is split in two, one side nodding, the other shaking its head. This is where the paradox becomes more than philosophy. It becomes personal. It whispers that people might live their entire lives with truths they never internalize. That belief is not a switch you flip with evidence. That part of you can know the facts, and another part, deeper, darker, refuses to accept them. It's a crack in the self, one that logic alone cannot seal. Moore's paradox doesn't just expose a linguistic oddity, it reveals the haunting fragility of belief, the way minds can live beside truth, brush against it, even speak it aloud, while remaining untouched inside. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this: the mind that says, I don't believe it, might be the most honest one of all. Moral dilemmas with no good outcome. Some moral dilemmas don't ask which path is better. They ask which wound bleeds slower. These are the kinds of ethical traps where every option leaves something broken, where every choice means betraying a value that was never supposed to be negotiable. They reveal the darkest truth about morality, that sometimes it doesn't guide, it condemns, not because one is choosing evil, but because all the choices are soaked in it. Picture a doctor with 5 dying patients, each needing a different organ to survive. A healthy traveler walks into the hospital for a routine checkup. No family, no connections, a perfect match. If the doctor secretly ends that one life, 5 are saved. If not, 5 die. Do nothing and death wins. Do something and murder wins. The math and the morality rip in opposite directions. There's no decision that doesn't leave a stain. Or take a soldier ordered to burn a village harboring rebels. If he obeys, civilians die. If he disobeys, he's executed and someone else takes his place, one with no hesitation. If he acts, he kills. If he refuses, he lets others be killed anyway. There is no version of the future where his hands stay clean. These are not edge cases. These are the blind spots of ethics, moments where the system collapses under its own weight, and once someone has stood in one, nothing is ever the same again, because even if they choose the lesser evil, the evil still happens, and worse, they caused it. These moments rewrite people, they infect the memory, they linger at night not as mistakes, but as scars carved by doing what was necessary, and unforgivable. What makes these dilemmas so disturbing isn't just the lack of good outcomes, it's what they reveal about morality itself, that it can become a labyrinth with no exit, that goodness can be mutually exclusive, that sometimes being moral at all means choosing to be condemned. There's no applause, no relief, just the silence of a world that demanded the impossible and watched without blinking as someone failed to be everything it wanted. These aren't puzzles, they're mirrors. They show how fragile human ideals are when cracked by reality. And the deepest terror is this: sometimes the moral thing is to suffer because of the right choice, or worse, to suffer because there wasn't one. The lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is the quiet death of certainty, disguised as common sense. It begins with something everyone understands: a lottery with 1,000,000 tickets. Only one will win. Each ticket has a 1 in a million chance, almost zero. So for any single ticket, it's perfectly reasonable to believe this ticket will lose. You could say that about ticket no 1, ticket no 2, ticket 3, all the way to ticket no 1,000,000. And you'd probably be right 999 times. But here's the paradox. If you believe that every single ticket will lose, then you also believe that no ticket will win, which you know is false. Someone will win. So now you're holding a set of beliefs that are individually rational, but collectively impossible. The very act of trusting logic for each case builds a contradiction for the whole. This isn't just about lotteries. It's about how the mind handles probability, truth, and belief in everyday life. The paradox reveals something disturbing, that you can believe reasonable things one by one and still end up believing something deeply unreasonable in total. It shows that rational belief is not always logically consistent. The mind, trying to be careful and cautious, quietly builds itself a lie. It gets worse when applied to real life. Think about criminal trials. Each piece of evidence may suggest guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but if you add enough weak pieces together, do they create certainty or just the illusion of it? Think about medical diagnoses. Each symptom may suggest something unlikely, but the accumulation starts to feel persuasive. The lottery paradox warns, adding up individually strong beliefs can still lead to a false conclusion. The paradox also twists the idea of justification. If it's justified to believe ticket number 1 will lose, and ticket number 2, and so on, how do you stop yourself from making the leap to all tickets will lose? Where's the cutoff between rational caution and irrational denial? How does the brain know when it's crossed the line? The lottery paradox doesn't scream like a contradiction. It whispers like a trap, a slow build of perfectly reasonable steps that ends in an unreasonable cliff. It exposes the limits of logic in a world of uncertainty, and it forces a painful question. How much can you believe before belief itself breaks? Rawls's veil of ignorance in action. Rawls's veil of ignorance seems noble at first glance, a thought experiment meant to generate fairness by stripping away self-interest. But once imagined in action, it stops being theory. It becomes a quiet nightmare, a simulation of justice where identity is erased and the cost of empathy is the annihilation of the self. Rawls asks this: if society were redesigned from scratch, how would its rules look if no one knew who they'd be within it? Rich or poor, strong or sick, male or female, privileged or persecuted. Behind this veil of ignorance, no one gets to assume a role. No one gets to bet on being lucky. In that uncertainty, people would build a system that protects the worst off because they might be the worst off. It's a tool for fairness, but it only works by forcing a terrifying condition: complete detachment from identity. In action, the veil becomes psychological obliteration. To walk behind it is to let go of every marker of self: your name, your memories, your story, your face. All that remains is a mind forced to see society from nowhere, from everyone. And from that nowhere, you must now decide the rules that will bind your future. Rules for suffering, for punishment, for privilege, for dignity. And you have no clue where you will land. This changes everything. Suddenly, approving a system where a few get everything and most scrape by becomes a gamble you may lose. Suddenly, ignoring healthcare, housing, or education becomes a death sentence that might be your own. Your empathy is no longer theoretical. It's insurance. It's a survival mechanism inside a morality game rigged with existential Russian roulette. And here's where it starts to feel like horror. The veil exposes how much of ethics is built on luck. How many people justify injustice because it benefits their role. But behind the veil, there are no roles, no certainty, just the sickening possibility that the system will bury you if you're wrong. The veil of ignorance isn't a utopian fantasy. It's a test of who people are when stripped of everything they cling to. And the truth it reveals is haunting. Most would never accept the rules of the world they live in if they didn't know they were on the winning side. In action, Rawls's veil becomes a mirror held up to society, and the reflection is ugly. A civilization built on the fantasy that fairness exists while rewarding those who already know they'll never be the ones crushed beneath it.